Chapter 23 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 Christmas on the Prairies. The blizzard which so nearly cost Joshua Peniman and Sam their lives raged unabated for 3 days. When it was over, the prairies lay a vast wilderness of unbroken white from horizon to horizon, the snow lying 5 feet deep on the level. For several days Mr. Peniman was compelled to remain in bed, completely prostrated by the experience he had been through. But Sam, though somewhat frostbitten in places, awoke the next morning as well as ever, and greatly exalted by the sense of being a hero. The blizzard was followed by a spell of bitterly cold weather, the thermometer going down to 36 below. While the family all felt great anxiety about the abandoned wagon and its precious contents, it was impossible to go after it until the weather moderated. In the meantime they employed the hours of the long, cold days by making runners, one pair of which they affixed to Joe's wagon, carrying the other pair with them. When a day at last came when the weather had so far moderated that they dared face it without danger of freezing, they set out with all 6 horses, Jim and Charley drawing the wagon on runners, in which Mr. Peniman, Joe, Sam, and Lige rode, Joe leading his own team, and Lige the Carroll horses, which had been rechristened Major and Nellie. There was a hard, solid crust over the deep drifts that carried them safely, and the sun sparkled like diamonds over the vast, unbroken expanse of spotless white. On their way they saw 3 gray wolves and 10 elk, which came within 200 yards of them, driven to forget fear by hunger. As the impoverished sledge glided smoothly over the snow, the thoughts of the whole party were busy with the dangers and terrors of the blizzard. "It was just about here that we found that poor old Indian, Lige," said Joe, scanning the snow-covered prairies about them. "Yes, I don't see any sign of him now, though," replied Lige. "What Indian?" asked Mr. Peniman. "When we were coming out to meet you we came upon the body of an Indian, dead and half covered by snow," answered Joe. "I thought after we'd got you safe home we'd come back and bury him. But I guess the snow has done that better than we could. Poor fellow." "Did you know him?" "No, I never saw him before." "Did you see any signs of any other Indians about?" "No, he seemed to be all alone. And the funny thing to me was that we didn't see any signs of his pony. It seemed queer that an Indian should be way off here alone, on foot. If you'd looked far enough you would probably have found his pony in some draw or ravine. The poor fellow probably got lost in the blizzard, and feeling himself freezing to death deserted his horse in a drift somewhere, perhaps, and was making for some place of shelter when cold and exhaustion overcame him." "Golly, it sure gave us a shock when we found him," broke in Lige. "I didn't see him, but Joe thought at first it was you or Sam." "Thank God it was not," said Joshua Peniman fervently. "I know what the poor fellow must have suffered. I thought at one time his fate would surely be ours." They found the wagon exactly where they had left it, completely covered over by a drift, its contents undisturbed, and practically uninjured by the storm. When it was unloaded they removed the wheels and affixed to the bottom the extra pair of runners. They then replaced the contents, harnessed Kit, Billy, and Black Major to it, while Jim, Charley, and Nellie were put to the other wagon. It was well for them that they had 6 powerful horses to pull the load, for weighted as the wagons now were, they continually broke through the crust, and the journey back to the homestead required constant use of picks and shovels, and all the strength, initiative, and energy of both drivers and horses. They reached home at last, and as soon as they had warmed, eaten, and rested a little, immediately set to work to install the new heating stove. That night the family did not shiver about the stove in the kitchen, but clustered about in the warm glow of the new heater, cozy and comfortable, and thankful from the bottoms of their hearts. They enjoyed with the relish of appetites long denied the candy and popcorn and peanuts that Sam had brought to them. That winter, the winter of 1856-7, will long be remembered on the prairies. From December until March, storm followed storm, blizzard followed blizzard. The time between filled in with the coldest weather ever known in the West. The young Penimans, who had run as free as wild antelopes over the plains ever since their arrival, were now compelled to stay in the house, which, small and circumscribed as it was sometimes almost too small to hold them. One morning, when the snow drove against the windows and a bitter wind howled across the prairies, Mrs. Peniman looked across the breakfast table at her husband with a smile. "Father," she said, "does thee not think that the time has come for us to begin our school?" "I certainly do, my dear," replied Joshua Peniman. "I was thinking of suggesting it this morning. The children have been out of school too long now, but with all the work we had to do to make living conditions possible for the winter, we have not had time to get our school started before. But now is the time to do it. They cannot be outdoors, there is little work about the place that can be done in this weather, and it will occupy their time and attention." "But we haven't any school to go to, Father," cried Ruth, "nor any books or teachers." Mrs. Peniman laughed. "Just wait and see," she said. "Your school is going to be right here, and Father and I will be the teachers. Didn't you know that Father used to be a teacher in the Friends' School at home? And the books are right in the trunk over there." "I don't want to go to school," grumbled Sam. "I want to play outdoors." "I do," cried Joe. "I want to study. Can you teach us history and language and algebra, Father?" Mr. Peniman smiled. "I have taught older and wiser boys than you, Joe, and I think I can teach you any branches that you will need to take up now." "All right, then, I'm all for it," declared Lige. "Let's get our school started this morning." It was quite a game after all, and they all entered gaily into the spirit of it, everybody helping to push the furniture about and arrange boxes and tables and chairs for the school. Mrs. Peniman took Sarah, Paul, Mary, and David into the rear part of the sod house and drew the curtains between, and Mr. Peniman got out the school books they had brought with them from Ohio and set Joe, Lige, Sam, Nina, and Ruth at work. The program was so arranged that while some of the more advanced pupils, as Joe and Lige, were studying, the less advanced, as Sam and Ruth, were reciting. As Sam and Ruth had always kept pretty well together in their classes, they were a great help to one another, but Nina was a problem. While far in advance of Sam and Ruth in English, geography, reading, and spelling, she was hopelessly behind them in grammar and mathematics. Indeed, her whole curriculum of studies had been so superficially and sketchily acquired that Mr. Peniman scarcely knew what to do with her. "I think I'll have to put you up a grade, Nina," he told her jokingly. "You are far and away above Ruth and Sam, yet I hardly think that on account of your arithmetic you could keep up with Lige and Joe." "Oh, please do put me up with Lige and Joe, Father Peniman," begged Nina. "I have never really studied in my life, but I believe that I could keep up if I studied with Joe." At first she made sad work of her lessons. Her work was brilliant but superficial, and Mr. Peniman, who insisted on thoroughness, was completely discouraged with her. On one occasion, when she had signally failed in a recitation and had retired to her seat in tears, Joe came to her side to comfort her. "You don't know how to study, that's what's the matter with you, Princess," he told her. "Let me help you. We'll get our lessons together this evening." Nina smiled up at him through her tears. "Oh, thank you, Josie," she whispered. "I know I don't know how to study. I never really went to school. I always had governesses and tutors and never had to. But I can learn. I know I can, if you will teach me." And after that Joe and Nina always studied together, Joe's thorough, methodical mind acting as a balance as well as an incentive to the more brilliant but less logical mind of Nina. Mrs. Peniman, meanwhile, with her little flock gathered about her knees, had various and sundry milestones on the road of knowledge to start from. While Paul read and spelled well, wrote a fine large hand, and had been initiated into the mysteries of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, Sarah was only staggering through simple addition, stumbled sadly in reading, and was still scrawling huge hieroglyphics that only by the greatest courtesy could be called writing. Mary knew her letters and was in the CAT cat and RAT rat stage of development, and little David was still at sea in an ocean of letters, from which he could pick out a round O or a crooked S on occasion. It was not easy teaching, but the parents had given up their home and friends and all the comforts of life to obtain for these young people greater and better opportunities, and were not to be balked by small difficulties. Day after day, while the snow fell and the wind howled across the prairies, the little school went on, and soon began to grow accustomed to the conditions, and the pupils to make rapid strides. They rose early, and while Mr. Peniman and the older boys went outside to do the necessary work, Mrs. Peniman with Ruth, Nina, and Mary got the breakfast, washed up the dishes, made the beds, put the house in order, and arranged the 2 rooms for the school by 9 o'clock, when the father and boys came in to begin the morning session. At noon Mrs. Peniman dismissed her little pupils, with orders to play quietly and not disturb the students in the front part of the house, while she prepared dinner. At 12:30 Mr. Peniman closed the morning session, and they all ran out for a tussle with the wind or a frolic in the snow before dinner. When the meal had been eaten and cleared away, the afternoon session was begun, and until 4 o'clock the little sod house was a very hive of activity, after which time they were all free, and while Mr. Peniman and the boys went out to do the evening chores and other outside work, the younger children romped about until supper time, soon after which they all went to bed. On the morning of December the 24th, Mr. Peniman announced at the breakfast table that they were to have a half holiday. "As this is the day before Christmas," he continued, "I think we will have to go out and see if we can't find some mistletoe and greens of some kind, and a tree that might serve for a Christmas tree." "A Christmas tree!" the children all shouted in a breath. "Are we going to have a Christmas tree?" "Why, of course," smiled Mrs. Peniman. "Santa Claus has never failed to visit us yet, has he, Ruthie? And I don't believe he'll forget us this year, even if we are away off out here on the prairies." Nina looked up with beaming eyes. "Oh, I'm so glad. I thought maybe we weren't going to have any Christmas. I've been thinking and thinking about it, but I didn't like to say anything, 'fraid it would make you feel badly." "We'll have some kind of a Christmas, my dear," said Mr. Peniman. "It may not be the kind of a Christmas that you have always been accustomed to, but we will celebrate the dear day in some way." Directly after dinner they all set off down the river bank, the boys in high boots, ear caps, big coats, and mittens, the girls muffled to the eyes in coats, furs, scarfs, big Alaska overshoes, and leggings, and Mrs. Peniman looking very fat and pudgy in a pair of Mr. Peniman's trousers, over which she wore a huge woolly coat and hood, with scarf and mittens, and was bundled up so she looked like the little old woman who lived in the shoe. They all set out in high spirits and slid, slipped, coasted, snowballed, and indulged in wild frolics over the snow, while Mr. and Mrs. Peniman took turns riding on the sled, which their wild young chargers took delight in upsetting as often as possible. After long search they at last found a young pine tree which came to a fine apex at the height of about 5 feet, and in the woods they found bright red berries, mistletoe in the tops of some trees, which Lige and Sam were only too pleased to climb, and deep under the snow some kinnikinick, with which its dainty green leaves and red berries made wonderful decorations. They returned home with the sled laden and in high glee. The tree was set up in a corner of the soddy that evening after supper, and when popcorn was strung from limb to limb, apples and oranges hung from the branches, small sacks of candy tied on, and the candles, which Mr. Peniman had thoughtfully provided on his almost fatal trip to Omaha, carefully disposed among the branches and lighted, it was a glorious sight. Beneath it on the floor were a great heap of queer-looking bumpy bundles, to which each one brought his or her contribution with great secrecy, and which were not one of them opened until the next morning. It was scarcely light on Christmas morning when a great jingling outside, which, of course, no one recognized as the notes of the dinner bell, announced the arrival of Santa Claus. There was a great hemming and hawing, a great stamping of feet in the snow, and then the door opened, and Santa Claus, in a marvelous wig and whiskers, made out of the wool of a pair of old gray woolen stockings, and a wonderful costume, which of course no one recognized as a suit of red flannel underwear elegantly trimmed in strips of white cotton flannel, came prancing in with a sack on his back and began dispensing presents with a generous hand. There were dolls for Mary and Sarah, writing paper and ribbons and pretty handkerchiefs for Nina and Ruth, books and neckties for Joe, ties, handkerchiefs, and a handsome muffler for Lige, balls and bats and tops and gloves for Sam and Paul, and a great lot of toys, including the remarkable hobby horse that Sam had bought him for little David. But if the children had been remembered well, neither Mr. nor Mrs. Peniman had been forgotten. Mrs. Peniman's heart was deeply touched by the gift of a beautiful white apron, made from one of her own pretty white dresses with infinite pains and secrecy by Nina, who gave Ruth a beautiful sash ribbon with hair ribbons to match out of her own little store, Sarah ribbons, a sash ribbon and a pretty white dress, and Lige and Sam her own gold pencil and a box of drawing crayons. But to Joe she gave her dearest treasure, a pretty red morocco book of verses, which her father had given to her on her last birthday, with an inscription written on the inside which deeply touched Joe's heart. For Mr. Peniman she made a pen wiper out of one of her own little felt shoes. Joe and Lige had nothing to give their father and mother but their kisses and love, but for each of the children they had made or contrived in secret some little toy that added to the merriment of the day, and fully as welcome and as much appreciated as if they had come from a city store. Mrs. Peniman delighted her husband by bringing forth from one of the knobby bundles under the tree 3 fine new shirts, made at night and in secret with the labor of her own tired hands, and Mr. Peniman handed to her a bundle from underneath the tree that had come all the way from Omaha the day of the blizzard, and had laid out in the wagon under the snow for more than a week. It contained a handsome new dress, which everybody praised and admired tremendously, and was as delighted over as if it had been given to themselves. Altogether it was a most wonderful Christmas. The dinner, at which a wild turkey took the place of the usual tame one, and at which the wild grape jelly and the plum preserves and a real plum pudding, made weeks before and hidden away for the occasion, was pronounced a grand success. The afternoon was spent in games, winding up with a great snow frolic, and snow cream for supper. But when the evening came and the younger children had gone to bed, the others gathered close about the fire, and quiet gradually settled down upon them. It had been a happy day, but now as the evening shadows gathered, memories of other Christmases came out of the dusk and lingered about them. To Mr. and Mrs. Peniman the memory of the little one they had lost, the tiny grave left behind there on the desolate loneliness of the prairies, was seldom out of their thoughts. And now as their thoughts traveled back over the past, bringing up to them the memories of Christmas at the old home, and the dear ones they were perhaps never to see again, there came a deep sadness that neither of them would permit themselves to express. To Joe and Lige and Sam and Ruth, this Christmas evening was also bringing memories. They could never forget the old home they had loved so well in the Muskingum Valley, nor the dear grandmother, the aunts and cousins and friends whom they had left behind. But to Nina, sitting with her chin cupped in her hand and her lovely violet eyes gazing into the fire, came the saddest memories. She thought of her last Christmas, and of that dear father and mother whom she had so loved and who had always done so much to make her life a happy one, and the tears brimmed her eyes. She thought of her father's illness, the strange cloud that always seemed to be hanging over them, of their journey westward, and of the tragic death of both her parents on the plains. She remembered as if she had seen it yesterday the two long graves side by side with the wooden cross at the head and the morning sunlight shining down upon the fresh earth and newly turned sod. Then her thoughts went forward over the months since, with all the mystery and terror that had surrounded her, and a great wonder and terror grew in her mind. Wonder of that mystery that hung about her, terror of that menace that seemed to so darkly pursue her, fear of what the years might have in store for her, who knew so little of who she was or where she belonged. As the recollection of her lonely state came over her, she heaved a deep, quivering sigh. The room was in darkness except for the firelight that threw its flickering light upon their faces, and as tears welled into her eyes she felt a hand slipped into her own, and turned to see Joe sitting on a box at her feet, and looking up at her with an expression of such deep tenderness and sympathy in his eyes that she knew he understood what was passing in her mind. "It's all right, Josie," she whispered, blinking the teardrops from her lashes. "I was only thinking, and you know——" "I know, Princess," he said, pressing her hand tenderly. "I know." That was all, but it was enough for Nina. The pressure of that warm, strong young hand in hers, the sympathy in those honest gray eyes, banished the shadows that had been creeping round her as if by magic. Somehow the knowledge that Joe was near, that Joe understood, chased away the feeling of loneliness and mystery, and made her feel safe and happy again. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Ruth Makes a Discovery. The winter passed swiftly. With the school to take up their time and attention in the daytime, and games and talk and popping corn and telling stories in the evening, the time crept by. And almost before they knew it, it was spring. March brought sunny days, thawing weather, and big rains, with blue skies and balmy winds that soon melted the snow and sent it scurrying in foaming torrents down the beds of all the creeks and streams. Very soon after the snows began to go, a wonderful thing happened. They woke one morning to see a train of emigrant wagons coming across the plains, and that day a new settler came to the Blue River, bringing with him a wife, 2 sons, and a daughter. They came directly to the Pennimans' homestead for advice and directions, and the original settlers on the river were delighted beyond measure to find them refined and intelligent people, who, like themselves, had desired to better their condition and had dared the dangers of the frontier life to provide themselves with wider opportunities and a better home. The name of the family was James, and they came from Iowa. The two sons, Herbert and Arthur, were 17 and 15, while the daughter, Beatrice, was nearly the same age as Ruth, a pretty, fair-haired, slender girl with soft brown eyes that looked like the heart of a pansy. They remained with the Peniman family that day, and the two families fraternized immediately. It was a great joy to those who had been living in such lonely conditions to meet and talk with people from the outside world. Mrs. James and Mrs. Peniman exchanged confidences in regard to heating and housing and obtaining fuel and provisions. The men talked farm land and crops and sod houses and dugouts, while the young people explored the river and became friends from the very beginning. Few papers or news of any kind had reached the homestead during the winter, and Joshua Peniman heard with a sinking heart of the slavery agitation that seemed to be continually increasing and growing daily a greater menace to the security of the nation. Joe, too, was listening to the news from the outside world with great interest. Herbert James, a tall, fine-looking, manly young fellow of 17, who had been attending school in the East, was full of the threatening conditions of the country. He talked of the issue with keen, intelligent interest, and Joe listened with a strange thrill passing through his breast. The two boys soon became fast friends, while Lige and Arthur, who were past 15, also struck up a great friendship. Ruth, usually shy and quiet with strangers, expanded sunnily in the company of Beatrice, and she and Nina soon became fast friends with her, a friendship that endured to the very end of their lives. Nothing else could have brought the satisfaction and joy to the Peniman family as did the coming of this pleasant, intelligent family. It brought to them companionship, added protection from the dangers that always surround the pioneer, and the added incentive of a new element in the making of their home on the prairies. The whole Peniman family went with them to select their location, which they had all decided should be very near, planned with them the site of their house, helped them in building it, assisted them in every way through those first hard months that were the lot of the pioneer in a new country, and gave them the benefit of their valuable experience. The James family settled on a tract of land about half a mile to the west of them, and it was a relief to each family to know that the other was within call. The Jameses had brought with them a pony that Beatrice had always ridden and was exceedingly fond of, and one of the joys of the girls' early acquaintance was in taking turns riding on the back of gentle Flora. Ruth took to riding as a duck to water. In a few days she could ride as well as her instructor, and was never so happy as when catering over the prairies on Flora's back. One day toward the 1st of April, when the sun was shining brightly and a pleasant breeze blowing, she asked her mother if she might not take a little ride. Mrs. James remarked that it would be perfectly safe, as Flora was most gentle and reliable, and Mrs. Peniman gave her consent, cautioning her not to go too far away. Ruth had always been a passionate lover of animals, and the feel of the horse under her, the curve of the soft neck under her hand, the swift, smooth pace, exhilarated her as nothing had ever done before. The snow was going fast. Only in places now were there remains of the great drifts that had covered the plains throughout the winter. As she catered on she looked at them, wishing that they were all gone and that the beautiful wild flowers which adorn the prairies in the spring would soon come to gladden their hearts and eyes. Suddenly, as she rode, Flora started and swerved, and it was well for Ruth that she had a tight hold on the saddle or she would have gone off over her head. "Why, Flora!" she cried in surprise. "What's the matter?" Then started violently herself. as she looked down and saw, partially concealed by the remains of a great drift, the legs and feet of a man. She checked the pony abruptly and sat still, not knowing what to do. Then, being a brave girl and a true little pioneer, she scrambled down from the pony's back, slipped the bridle over her arm, and going to the body, kneeled down and scraped away the snow that covered it. It was still in good condition, the bitter cold of the winter and the snow packed about it having preserved it perfectly. As Ruth pushed aside the snow that concealed the face, she screamed aloud. "Eagle Eye! Oh, poor, poor Eagle Eye!" And being a real little woman, she sat down beside the body and began to cry. For a long time she kneeled beside the body of the young Indian whom she had so tenderly nursed back to health. The face looked just as she had seen it often, keen, thin, silent, the eyes closed, the grave lips motionless, the bronze-hued features set in the dignified mold of death. "Eagle Eye! Eagle Eye!" she called to him softly, placing her hands on his and bending nearer. "Oh, poor Eagle Eye! Where have you been? How did this terrible thing happen to you?" The cold, immovable face remained impassive. The grave, set lips made no reply. She rose presently and stood for a time looking down upon him. She knew that the body must not be left lying exposed on the prairie, that wolves, vultures, coyotes, the hideous carrion crows would soon find it. "I'll come back, Eagle Eye," she said as she left him. "Even if you were not grateful to us for what we did for you, we will see that you have a proper burial." She mounted the pony and had started to ride away when a little distance farther on she saw a black object in the snow. Curious as to what it might be, she rode to it. As she slipped from the pony's back and stooped over it, she saw that it was a black tin box, which had once had a lock, which had been broken and torn away. She examined it curiously, then tucking it under her arm, rode home as fast as Flora could carry her. "Mother, oh, Mother!" she shouted as she burst into the house. "I found Eagle Eye, our Eagle Eye, lying out there on the prairie, dead, under a snowdrift." "Eagle Eye? You mean our Eagle Eye, the young Indian we took care of after he was shot?" cried Mrs. Peniman, running to her. "Yes, yes." The tears were running down Ruth's cheeks now. "Oh, yes, Mother, our own Eagle Eye. And oh, Mother, he was lying right under a drift, and I saw his feet, and when I uncovered his face I saw that it was Eagle Eye. He must have got lost in the blizzard." "What's this? Who was lost in the blizzard?" asked Mr. Peniman, who had entered the house in time to hear the last words. Mrs. Peniman explained to him. "Eagle Eye!" he ejaculated. "He must have been trying to come to us. He must have got lost in the storm. Perhaps he had some message to bring to us. Perhaps he was not so ungrateful, so careless as he seemed." He stopped short, his eyes fixed with a strange stare upon the box that Ruth had entirely forgotten, and which she still clutched under her arm. "Ruth!" he shouted. "Where did you get that box? Where did it come from? How in the name of Heaven—" Ruth, startled half out of her wits at his face and voice, held out the box she had found on the prairies. "I found it, Father, out there on the prairies, just a little way from where Eagle Eye was lying. Why, Father, what is the matter? What makes you look so—" Her words died away as her father leaped forward and snatched the box from her hands. She saw him stoop and examine it, saw him stare into her mother's face, and saw her mother turn pale, as she murmured in a shaking voice, "The dispatch box! The dispatch box!" Ruth had heard of the dispatch box, although she had no remembrance of having ever seen it. The dispatch box? Nina's dispatch box that we lost, that was stolen from us by the Indians? But neither father nor mother heard her. Tears had sprung to Mrs. Peniman's eyes and were rolling down her cheeks, as she murmured over and over, "Poor Eagle Eye! Poor, loyal, grateful friend! How unjust we have been to you!" Joshua Peniman was examining the box. The lock was gone, but the box had been roughly wrapped about and tied with a piece of deer hide, and appeared to have remained undisturbed while it lay on the prairies. "He was bringing it to us," he said in a low voice. "You remember, Hannah, that I told him the whole story. I did not know then how much he understood, but he must have understood it all. He went back to his own people and got the papers, and was bringing them to us when the blizzard overtook him. Poor Eagle Eye! Poor loyal friend! He gave his life in our service." After a moment's thought he went on, "I wonder how he got it. I wonder what became of Red Snake. If he knows that this box has been taken from him he will never rest until he has his revenge and gets it back again. God protect us!" whispered Mrs. Peniman, turning pale. Joshua Peniman handed her the box quickly. "Put it away carefully," he said. "We will examine it more carefully when I come back. Just now our first duty is to Eagle Eye. Call the boys, Ruth. We must go after the body at once. I could not sleep this night knowing that the body of our faithful friend was lying uncovered on the plains." When they reached the spot where the body was lying, Joe uttered a surprised exclamation. "Why, that's the Indian Lige and I found the night you were lost in the blizzard. I remember him perfectly, but I had never seen him before. You know I was away all the time Eagle Eye was at our house. Lige never looked at him at all. We were both so cold and so scared and anxious about you. How do you suppose he came to be here?" "He was coming to us, Joe," Mr. Peniman answered solemnly. "He was bringing to us a thing that we, all of us, would have been willing to pay any price to receive, and he gave his life in our service." Joe stared. "What, Father? What was he bringing?" "He was bringing Nina's dispatch box. The box that was stolen from the wagon the night of the Indian raid." Joe started, and a strange, startled expression passed over his face. "Where was it?" he asked. "On the prairie, very near his body. Ruth found it there." "Great heavens! I kicked it with my foot the night of the blizzard. I thought it was a tin can. Nina's dispatch box! And it has lain all these months on the prairies." "God is good," murmured Mr. Peniman. But Joe answered nothing, but stared at his father with distended eyes. Chapter 25 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 The Dispatch Box. When they had brought Eagle Eye home and buried him under the willow tree on the river bank, Joe went directly to his mother. He was 17 now, and the dangers and hardships he had been through and the responsibilities that had been thrust upon him made him appear much older than his years. "Mother," he said in a low, trembling voice, "have you told Nina? Does she know?" "Not yet, dear. There has not been time. It will of course be something of a shock to her, and I want to tell her when we are quiet and alone and I can prepare her for it." For a moment the boy stood silent, his head bent forward on his breast. Then he burst out impetuously. "Do you think we'd better tell her at all, Mother? She is contented and happy here. Why should we tell her something that might take her away from us forever? I have always known that she was different, somehow. And this box probably contains the information about her own people and all that. If she gets it, why, she will probably go back to them and—" The troubled voice ceased, and his mother bent forward and putting her hand under his chin raised his face to hers. "Why, Joe!" she exclaimed. "Why, Joe! Is that my own boy speaking like this? You would keep the knowledge that must be of such inestimable value to Nina away from her because perchance we should lose her, lest she should leave us, to further her own happiness and prosperity in life?" Joe bent his head and his face crimsoned. "I know I'm selfish, Mother," he blurted out. "I know I shouldn't even allow myself to think of such a thing. But when I think of her leaving us, of going off to live with someone else, I just can't stand it." Then raising his head and fixing his deep gray eyes upon his mother's face, "I'd rather die than live without Nina." When she had at last sent him away to bed, Hannah Peniman sat for a long time before the dying fire. Joe, her son, her baby, was not a boy any more. He was a man. The eyes that had looked into hers this night, the voice that had spoken out of a heart yet unknown to itself, were not the eyes, the voice of a child. And the knowledge left pain in her heart and wonder. She rose presently and going to the door called Nina. As the girl came bounding into the room Hannah Peniman looked at her with new eyes. The little princess was now a slender, graceful, beautiful girl of 14, with a head of rippling gold, eyes like wood violets, and a face so entrancingly lovely that Mrs. Peniman's heart sank as she looked at it. She drew the girl gently down on a chair beside her. "Listen, dear." Her voice was low, almost sad, as she spoke. "You never knew the Indian that Ruth found on the prairies today, and that Father and the boys buried this evening. But he has done you a great and inestimable service. You have heard us speak of him, and how we took care of Eagle Eye when he was wounded. That was at the time that both you and Joe were away, after you were kidnapped by the Indians. Father Peniman trusted Eagle Eye, and told him your story. He went away without a word, but in some way he got possession of the box containing your papers." Nina started up from her chair. "The box? The dispatch box? That Mother left me?" "Yes, Nina. He got it and he was bringing it back to us when he became lost in the blizzard. He gave his life in the effort to restore it." "But the box, the box, Mother's box!" cried Nina, her hands clasped, her face white, her eyes wide and pleading. "That was the box that Ruth found this afternoon lying on the prairie beside Eagle Eye's body." "And you have it? You got it? It—" Her agitation was too great for words. Mrs. Peniman laid her hand over the little shaking hands that were clasped against Nina's breast. "Yes, dear, we have it." She rose and going to her trunk brought forth the box and put it into Nina's hands. The girl clasped it, bent over it, pressed it to her bosom, and burst into a flood of tears. "It is all that I have of them," she whispered, "all that I have to remember either of them. Oh, I hope there is a picture of Mother in the box, some letters, something to make me know more about my dear, dear father and mother." At this moment Mr. Peniman entered the room. He crossed silently to the table and stood beside it while Nina with shaking fingers unfastened the thongs that were bound about the box and raised the lid. On the top were two long folded papers. She opened these and glanced at them hastily, then threw them on the table. They were deeds, executed many years before, to Lee C. Carroll, by his father, Edgar M. Carroll, conveying to him and his heirs forever sole title to certain properties in St. Louis and New York. There was a tray in the box, and with trembling hands Nina raised this eagerly, hoping to find the treasures she had coveted in the space below. There was nothing in it but a heap of ashes. The base, vindictive nature of the renegade, while leaving in the box the deeds to a property he dared not claim, incited him with devilish malice to destroy all the personal papers, all data, every scrap of information that could lead to the restoration of the child to her friends and relatives, or her place in society. When the full realization of what had been done came upon her, Nina uttered a heartbroken cry and cast herself into Mrs. Peniman's arms. With eyes that could scarce credit the evidence of their senses, the man and woman gazed into the box. Nothing there but ashes. Nothing to pay for the life that had been given. Nothing to bring to the helpless young girl the knowledge without which she was cut off from all family relation or connection with the life from which she came. Nothing to help her to establish her identity, or enable her to claim the property, the deeds of which had been so sarcastically left in the box. The utter maliciousness of it, the cold, cruel, calculating vindictiveness of the deed left them stunned. "Don't grieve so, darling," Hannah Peniman muttered, stroking the golden head and pressing it to her breast. "You have the deeds, and they mean a great deal. Property in those two big cities must be worth a great deal of money now." "But I don't want money," sobbed Nina broken-heartedly. "I don't care anything about the deeds. He might as well have burned them, too. What do I want of property in New York or St. Louis? I'll probably never go there. I don't want to go there. I want to stay here with you." But what I wanted, what I hoped we would find in the box, were pictures of Papa and Mama, letters from them, things about them and me, so that I would know something about them, about myself, so that I wouldn't feel myself a poor, forsaken, friendless waif, dependent upon your charity for all I have and am. Joshua Peniman crossed the room and laid his hand upon her head. "You are not a friendless waif, Princess," he said in his low, gentle voice. "You are our daughter, beloved, cherished, as much as Sarah or Ruth." Then, taking up the deeds from the table, he examined them carefully. "This is very strange," he mused. "I can't understand it. Why should he have left the deeds and destroyed everything else in the box? There is a considerable quantity of ashes here. The box must have been full of papers. Why should that villain have destroyed them all and left these deeds? I cannot understand it." He puzzled over it long after Nina had sobbed herself to sleep in Ruth's loving arms. Where was Red Snake? Why had he burned the contents of this box? How had the box come to be in the possession of Eagle Eye? What had they to expect from this new complication in a mystery he was unable to unravel? Little could he guess, as he went abstractedly about his work the next day, how those questions were to be answered, or how closely that mystery was to affect the lives of himself and those who were dear to him. Chapter 26 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Trouble Brewing. The spring of 1857 was a time of promise for the Nebraska settlers. Timely rains had fallen. The few little fields of wheat and corn promised good harvests. Elk, deer, antelope, grouse, and wild turkey were abundant. Buffaloes came close to their settlement, and they were fortunate enough to get many hides and much meat. The Sioux had fought a great battle with the whites at Ash Hollow and had been badly beaten and wanted nothing so much as peace. $50,000 had been voted by Congress to build a capitol at Omaha, and 50,000 more to build roads through the territory. With the advance of spring, more settlers began to come in. There was now a little settlement at Beaver Creek, some 5 miles away, and during the summer several families located along the Blue, and a thriving settlement started up on the Little Blue, some 3 or 4 miles away, which was called Milford. Meanwhile, the friendship of the Peniman family and their new neighbors, the Jameses, were growing apace. To Mr. Peniman, the presence of a neighbor, a man who was concerned with the same problems, the same dangers, and the same experiments as himself, was a great boon. He now had another man to talk to plan with, to rely upon in case the danger of which he was in continual fear should come upon them. To Mrs. Peniman the companionship of another woman was a blessing almost beyond expression, and to the girls the presence of another young girl in the neighborhood brought a new interest in life. But it was to Lige and Joe that the coming of the new homesteaders brought the greatest significance. The James boys had always lived in towns and had a knowledge and sophistication of which the country-raised Peniman lads were entirely lacking. They had also had much better educational facilities, and there was much that Joe and Lige could learn from them. The 4 boys became staunch friends, and in talking with Herbert, Joe again felt his ambitions stimulated to study law. When the snow had gone and the bright spring sunshine had dried up the prairies sufficiently to allow of travel, Joshua Peniman proposed to Joe that he should go to Omaha in his place, have the wagon mended, and bring back some spring supplies. "There is so much work to be done this spring that I don't feel that I can go," he said. "I would not like to have you make the long trip alone, but the Jameses are needing some things too, and you and Herbert can make the trip together." So it was arranged, and on a brilliant spring morning, when the sky arched like a bowl of sapphire above their heads, when the meadow larks sang in the grass, and the wind whispered softly over the prairies that here and there were already showing a touch of green, the 2 lads set off together. It was a long drive, and on the way they talked of many things. Herbert, who was a fine, quiet, serious-minded boy, was thinking much of the political situation of the country, which this spring was showing signs of much bitterness and agitation. "I tell you things are in serious condition," he said. "We are going on indifferently living over a volcano, and it's going to burst out some day when people are least expecting it. Slavery is a curse that no civilized country can exist under. Are we going to keep quiet and let Kansas come into the Union as a slave state?" Joe's eyes blazed. "Of course we're not. That would be a terrible thing," he cried. "Then what are we going to do about it? Are men like Douglas going to blind the eyes and muffle the ears of the American people until we get all tied up in legislation that will give a preponderance of the Western states to slavery?" When they reached Omaha they found the entire community asking the same question. On street corners, in stores, in halls, churches, meeting places of all kinds, the question of slavery was being discussed, not calmly and dispassionately, but with a bitterness that was disturbing business, separating families, setting fathers and sons, brother and brother, apart. Joe listened to it all with a growing feeling of anxiety. In spite of himself, he found himself constantly being drawn into arguments, contending hotly on a question that he felt keenly that he knew too little about. In a store where the 2 lads went to buy their provisions, they ran into a group of a dozen men or more who were hotly debating the slavery question. They intended to do their trading and get out as soon as possible, but the proprietor of the store was one of the principal arguers, so, leaning his back against the counter while he waited to have his order filled, Joe listened to the discussion. Before he was aware of what he was doing he had answered a tall, gangly Missourian with a tuft of whiskers on his chin, who was arguing for state rights, and the first thing he knew he was in the midst of a fiery controversy in which all the bystanders took violent sides. Among them was a man whose appearance had drawn his attention from the first moment he entered the store. At his first glance it had startled him with a strange sense of familiarity. Then the argument had claimed all his attention, and he noticed the man no more, until, having abruptly terminated his part in it, he gathered up his provisions and was leaving the store when the gentleman stepped up to him. "I congratulate you, young man," he said, holding out his hand. "You are a born orator. It does my heart good to hear the young fellows of our country take the stand that you just did. You are what I should call a real American. I'm afraid we have some tough times ahead of us before this thing is over, and it is to the young fellows like you that we may have to look for its settlement." "Do you mean that you think it will come to war?" "I begin to fear so. There is too much of a pull being made by the slave owners and slave states, and, I regret to say, by men in Congress, who ought to have a stronger sense of humanity and the country's danger." "I agree with you," answered Joe eagerly, and before he knew it he was speaking out his thoughts to this stranger, the long silent thoughts that had been forming themselves in his mind in the silence of the prairies, when he had brooded by himself about the subject of slavery and the danger of secession. When they had remained talking for some time the gentleman laid his hand on Joe's arm. "I like you, my young friend," he said. "You are a boy of much promise. Come up to my office with me. I am a lawyer. I'd like to talk with you further." Joe hesitated. He had much to do, but something in the man's face and manner, some strange, haunting sense of familiarity, the fascination of his presence, his smooth and elegant manner of speech, made an appeal to him that he could not resist. They went together to the lawyer's office, and Joe saw for the first time a real law office and a law library. When he saw the rows of shelves his eyes brightened. "Oh," he cried, "what a library! How splendid! How I should like to read them all!" The lawyer laughed. "I'm afraid you would find some of those books rather dry reading. They are all law books. A good many of them are reports." "I know. That is what interests me so much. All my life my greatest ambition has been to be a lawyer." "Is that possible?" cried the gentleman, evidently much pleased. "Well, well! So you would like to be a lawyer, would you? Why don't you, then? I am sure you would make a good one." Joe's face flushed with pleasure. "There is nothing in the world I want so much," he answered. "But we have a big family. My father is not a rich man, and we have recently homesteaded on the Blue. There is an awful lot of work to be done by pioneers, and I don't get much chance to read." Then, after a pause, "And besides, I haven't any books. Would you read them if you had?" "Yes, sir, I would indeed," Joe answered so promptly that the gentleman smiled. He rose presently and went to a case. "Here," he said, taking down 2 volumes. "Here's a copy of Blackstone and one of Kent's Commentaries. I'll lend them to you. Take them home with you, and after you have read and digested them, come back to me, and if I find that you have understood what you have read, I'll lend you some more." Joe's face crimsoned with joy. He stammered his thanks, and after shaking hands with his new acquaintance, and promising to call upon him the next time he came to Omaha, he left the office and joined Herbert, who was waiting for him at the store. When he told him of his experience and showed him the books, Herbert whistled. "Looks to me as if it was a lucky strike," he said. "Do you know who that man is? I saw that he had taken a notion to you and asked about him. He is Judge North, one of the leading men of the Territory, and the most prominent lawyer in the West." Joe was not surprised to hear that the man at whose office he had called and whose books he carried under his arm was one of the leading men of the Territory. There was that in his manner and appearance that proclaimed him a leader of men. Absently he opened one of the books. On the fly leaf was written in a bold, flowing hand, "John M. North, Attorney at Law." Joe pointed to the last words. "I hope to write that after my name some day," he said musingly. "I'll be your first client," laughed Herbert. "There's no telling but that you might," grinned Joe. "I might have to get you out of jail some day." As they hurried back to the place where they had left the wagon, Joe was overjoyed to find Pashepaho standing beside it. He greeted them with a broad grin. "Me wait," he said. "Me no horses." Joe grasped his hand and shook it with the cordiality of an old friend. Then he introduced Herbert, who looked with some astonishment upon this manner of greeting the red man of the plains. "Pashepaho is one of my best friends," Joe assured him. "He saved my life once, and probably the lives of the family. What are you doing here, Pashepaho?" "Come trade skin. What you do?" "We came in to get some provisions and get the wagon mended. It broke down in a blizzard last winter." "Heap cold." "It was an awful winter. Father and Sam almost got lost in the big blizzard." Then suddenly remembering, "Did you know that Eagle Eye is dead? He was coming to us, bringing Nina's dispatch box, when the blizzard overtook him. We found him dead not far from our house this spring." "Ai! Eagle Eye dead?" The Indian's sharp face clouded. "Heap good man." Then suddenly, "You know 'bout Red Snake?" "No." Joe turned on him sharply. "What about him? We have been awful uneasy ever since we knew that Eagle Eye got the box. We have been afraid he would come to take vengeance on us for it." "He no come now," said Pashepaho gravely. Then with a tone of surprise, "You no hear?" "No, we have heard nothing. We have been shut off there at the homestead with big snows all winter. What do you mean?" "Red Snake dead." Joe started and leaned forward staring into his face. "Dead? Red Snake dead? How? When? Where?" "Eagle Eye kill him." "Eagle Eye killed him? When?" "Many sleep ago. Shoot him with arrow." Joe stood as if transfixed, staring into his face. "Eagle Eye heap white man friend," Pashepaho went on. "I know he was. I know he was. He was our friend, our good, loyal friend. We felt awful bad when we found him. But how did it happen? How did he get the box, I wonder?" In his halting, broken English Pashepaho told him the story as he had heard it from the men of his own tribe. Joe was deeply affected. "Then he must have got the dispatch box after Red Snake was dead, and was bringing it to us when the blizzard overtook him. Good, faithful Eagle Eye! We thought he was not grateful for all the folks had done in nursing him back to life, but look how mistaken we were. He was a faithful friend." As Pashepaho shook his hand and rode away, Joe stood still in a profound reverie. A relief so great that it was almost like the falling of a great load from his shoulders came over him. Red Snake was dead. The danger that had hung so darkly and fearsomely over them was now removed. The menacing figure that had shadowed all their days and filled their nights with terror was gone forever. He could scarcely wait to get back home and tell the glad news to the family. As he hurriedly began to load the provisions into the wagon, two men in earnest conversation passed him. "We shall have war," one of them was saying. "There is no escaping it. The South is bound to secede." "The South is bound to secede?" The two lads turned and looked at one another, and into the consciousness of both some strange presence seemed to fall. "War," said Herbert in an awed tone. "War," repeated Joe. "I wonder what it would mean to me." Chapter 27 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27 War. The news that Joe brought back from his trip to Omaha, that Red Snake was dead and the dark menace so long hanging over them was removed forever, brought great relief to the whole Peniman family. To Nina especially did it seem to bring a sense of security she had never known since the day she had been kidnapped. She had recovered in a measure from the bitter disappointment of the violated dispatch box, though many nights, and often when she was alone, she felt deeply unhappy over her situation, and the unsolved mystery that seemed to cut her off from her own. As the summer advanced the young people of the two families were much together, and Hannah Peniman noticed with a smile, and yet a sigh, that the boys no longer went off by themselves on hunting or fishing or exploring expeditions, but that whenever they went the girls were usually with them, and that as the party came home, strolling across the prairies or along the river bank in the moonlight, that Nina and Joe were always together, that Herbert walked with Ruth, and that Lige larked and sang and frolicked with pretty, gay little Beatrice. Joe found little time for reading during the summer, but the law books which Judge North had lent him were his constant companions in the evening, and while he plowed and harrowed the fields in which their first crops were to be planted, he propped the Blackstone up at one end of the furrow, and while he traveled its length he recited over and over again a paragraph he had read at the start. When he reached the end of the furrow that paragraph was usually committed to memory, and he took another, reciting it over and over all down the long black furrow and back. In this way he read Blackstone through, acquiring so perfect a knowledge of its contents that he knew it almost by heart, and could quote from it verbatim to the very end of his life. His mind and thoughts were much occupied with the ominous news that continually reached them. Everywhere trouble seemed to be in the air. The violence and disorder in Kansas, where a state of civil war practically existed as the result of the pro-slavery demonstration at Lawrence, communicated itself across the border to the sister territory of Nebraska, and bitter arguments and controversy were heard wherever 2 or 3 people were gathered together. Such papers as they were able to obtain were full of menace. A seething current of excitement and unrest seemed permeating the whole nation, the North bitterly accusing the South of trying by trickery and treachery to force slavery upon the nation, the South maintaining that the North was fostering abolition, and that the real intent and purpose of the abolitionists was to arouse a slave insurrection and bring devastation to the whole South. The decision in the Dred Scott case and the framing of the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas increased the agitation of the slavery question to a burning issue, and Joe and Herbert, sometimes accompanied by Arthur and Lige, fell into the habit of riding over to the little cross-road store at Milford evenings to hear the latest news and listen to the discussion they always found going on there. Joshua Peniman made few comments on the situation, but he seized upon the papers with an eagerness that showed his interest, and read them with set lips and frowning brow. In October that year the little settlement of which the Peniman family had been the pioneers was increased by 6 families who homesteaded upon the West Blue and Middle Creek. A demand soon rose among them for a school which the children of the community could attend during the cold weather, and as there were no funds to provide such a school or pay a teacher, the settlers all came together at the Peniman homestead to discuss the matter and see what could be done. After much discussion it was agreed that they should build a little sod schoolhouse, large enough to accommodate the children of the neighborhood, and as Joshua Peniman was a natural leader among them and the best equipped for the purpose, that the men of the settlement should take upon themselves his work for certain hours of each day, while he in exchange should teach the school. He was the more willing to accede to this proposal because he had never entirely recovered from the effects of the exposure he had suffered in the blizzard, and was subject to rheumatism and bronchitis, and was not sorry to have the heavy outdoor work done by some of the younger and stronger men during the severity of the winter. A location was chosen on the prairies about midway between the different homesteads, and on a cold, bright morning in October the sod was broken for the schoolhouse. There were men and teams enough to accomplish its construction quickly, and within a few days a solid little structure about 30 feet square was erected. The question of heating and seating had arisen at the meeting, and it had been decided that each settler should furnish one desk or chair, and that each settler who had timber should cut a load of cordwood, and those who had no timber should contribute their share by hauling it to the nearest market and selling it, buying a stove with the proceeds. This program was carried out, two of the settlers who had no timber driving 40 miles to Nebraska City, where they bought a good second-hand stove, which was set up in the schoolhouse. The new schoolhouse was ready for occupation the 1st of November, and from that time on throughout the long, cold winter the little sod schoolhouse accommodated about 20 children, of all grades and sizes, of whom Joshua Peniman was the teacher. Within a short time after the opening of the school, a general feeling arose in the settlement that the Sabbath should be observed, and at the general request of the settlers, Joshua Peniman consented to act as leader, holding services every Sunday in the sod schoolhouse. As the settlers were of all creeds and denominations, the services were necessarily non-sectarian. The services were very simple, consisting of the reading of the Bible, prayers by members of the congregation, responsive reading from the Psalms, and hymns led by the clear, sweet voice of Hannah Peniman. In the fall of that year another great boom came to the pioneers. A stagecoach line was established, the terminal of which was the Big Sandy station on the Little Blue. This line carried mail and passengers, thus doing away with the long, lonely, dangerous ride across the prairies to get mail, and bringing a post office with mail and newspapers within 6 miles of the Peniman homestead. After that it was possible to get papers not more than a day or two old, and to send and receive letters without the perilous journey hitherto necessary. Joshua Peniman had proved up on his claim, and was holding fast to the claims he had staked out next to his own for Joe and Lige, with 2 other 160-acre tracts which he hoped to hold for Ruth and Nina as soon as they should be old enough to take them. The harvest of that year was rich and plentiful, and the winter of 1858-9 saw the family comfortably established in a home that was beginning to have the appearance of a real farm, with hay, grain, and corn stored in their granaries, a cow house and a chicken house added to the buildings, and many substantial improvements added to their dwelling. During the winter, whenever Joe could snatch time from his other duties, he and Herbert James trapped beaver, mink, and otter in the river. In Beaver Creek, where a beautiful little town was springing up, they got many fine beavers, the skins of which sold for from $2 to $3 a pound, many of the beavers weighing from 2 to 3 pounds apiece. With the money he made by the sale of the skins he bought law books, adding one at a time to his precious collection, and studying them so industriously that when he went to Omaha to return the books he had borrowed from Judge North, he rendered to the lawyer so good an account of his reading that the judge called him a prodigy. "You are the kind of boy I'd like," he said gently, patting Joe on the shoulder. "I'd like to take you into my office to study law. You are highly gifted, and I believe will make a great success of the profession." Joe glowed under his praise. Nothing would have given him greater happiness than to enter Judge North's fine offices as a student. It was a great temptation. But there was much work to be done at home. His father was no longer strong, and his work much interrupted by his teaching and ministerial duties, and much of the responsibility of the farm work had fallen upon him and Lige, who was now a tall, handsome, well-set-up lad of 17, while Joe had grown to the full stature of a man and was approaching his 19th birthday. "I can't come into your office now, Judge North," he answered regretfully, "but I would like to come and talk with you whenever I can, and have you advise and help me. I want to be a lawyer, and even though I cannot be spared from home now, I can go on preparing myself until the younger boys get old enough to take my place on the farm." "Good lad," said Judge North. "I like you none the less for your faithfulness to your duty." As he smiled at him again, that strange sense of familiarity came over the boy. Where had he seen that man before? Who was it of whom he so reminded him? There was something about him that was not like a stranger, that carried a subtle sense of warmth, affection to his heart. In the gleam of his deep blue eyes there came and went an expression that eluded him like an effervescent perfume. For some reason that he could not account for to himself, the lad's heart warmed to him strangely. In the long, friendly talk that followed Joe told him of his ambitions, and of how that ambition had been roused in his breast by hearing a lawyer, a man by the name of Lincoln, make a 4th of July speech in Illinois. "Lincoln!" said Judge North, much interested. "Do you mean Abraham Lincoln? Well, well, so you heard one of those great speeches, did you? I wish it had been my privilege. Have you followed his debates with Douglas? He has a grip on this slavery question that no other man in the country can equal. Did you know that he is being talked of as a candidate of the new Republican Party to succeed Buchanan as president?" "No," cried Joe, much astonished. "That Mr. Lincoln? Why, he was only a country lawyer, a member of the legislature from Sangamon County, when I heard him. He is the greatest man in this country today, a great lawyer, a great statesman. I hope that he may be elected." Joe went home more eager and encouraged in his study of the law than ever before. He felt that if in so short a time a country lawyer like Mr. Lincoln should have become the nominee for president, that there was hope for him in the years that lay before him. A few evenings after his return there was a citizens' meeting at Milford, and he and Herbert rode over. His father, who had automatically become the leader of the settlement, had been asked to preside. Joe had had no intention of speaking. His purpose was to attend the meeting simply as a spectator. But before he was aware of it, his blood was up and he was on his feet making a fiery anti-slavery speech. He scarcely knew what he was saying, but with the first words he uttered, all the long, deep thoughts that had been growing up within him while he worked in the fields, in the vast silence of the prairies, burst forth in a torrent, and he only came to himself when the little hall rocked with shouts and applause. After that he was often asked to speak at meetings, and no one was more astonished than he when he was asked to accept the presidency of the Young Men's Republican Club that was being organized in the county. Feeling was running hot and high everywhere, and in the fall, 1859, the torch was set to the smoldering powder of public opinion by John Brown's seizure of the National Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Instantly the war spirit of the country sprang to life. Troops were hurried to the spot and the little band of hot-headed abolitionists seized. But though they paid the penalty of their well-meant but misdirected enthusiasm with their lives, the blaze was started. Nothing could stop it now. War was inevitable. The song, "John Brown's body lies smoldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on," was born in a night and swept the country like wildfire, old men and young singing and cheering it. The Republican Party, born of the slavery agitation, grew apace and denied the authority of Congress, of a territorial legislature, or any individual to give existence to slavery in the territories. It repudiated the doctrine of state sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision, and nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. The nomination of the man whose anti-slavery speeches were read and quoted from ocean to ocean was a challenge thrown down to the slave-holding states, which responded to it with a haughty defiance and the nomination of John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. The Northern Democrats, unable to endorse the attitude of their Southern brothers, split from their own party and nominated Stephen A. Douglas. The nomination of Lincoln, his inspiration and guide, left no doubt in Joe's mind as to his course of action. He accepted the nomination of president of the Young Men's Republican Club, stripped off his coat, and plunged into the campaign with the same energy, the same efficiency, the same unbounded enthusiasm that he had always brought to every task before him. He spoke in sod houses, dugouts, schoolhouses, stores, churches, and halls, extolling the Republican candidate for president, and praising the man who seemed to him the very embodiment of the spirit of the freedom and democracy of America. At many of these meetings Joshua Peniman presided, and as he heard the fiery utterances of his son, his heart grew cold within his breast. The campaign was a fierce and bitter one, but Lincoln was elected. The South, angry, defiant, outraged by the election of a nigger lover, a plebeian, a country lawyer, and a rail splitter, and the defeat of their own aristocratic candidate, Mr. Breckinridge, was incensed to fury. Many times they had threatened that the Southern states would no longer remain in the Union if the Republican Party was successful, and on December 20th, 1860, they made good their threat. A popular convention at Charleston passed an order of secession. Throughout the intense excitement that followed, Joe and his father had many discussions, in some of which Lige joined. That war was inevitable they now knew, but how it was to be met by them, Quakers, was a thing upon which they could come to no agreement. "We cannot take up arms," Joshua Peniman said firmly. "We are Quakers. Our religion, the Bible, the Word of God Himself forbids it." "But it is our duty, Father," Joe urged passionately. "If we have to go to war with the South they will have all the advantage. They are ready for war. The Federal arsenals in the Southern states have fallen into their hands and furnished their soldiers with equipment. You know that we are not prepared. A great army will have to be raised and furnished with the munitions of war. Should we, whom you have always taught to love and honor the flag, sit still and see that flag torn down, our country divided and left a prey to foreign nations?" Joshua Peniman blanched. "God forbid!" he cried quickly. "But if it comes to that terrible pass, there are others, not Quakers, who have not been reared in the faith that make it impossible for them to fight. Let them go. Let them protect the country." "It will take all of us, Father," put in Lige. "This war is going to be no light matter. The South has the men, the money, the military training. It is going to take all the men the North can raise to hold the nation together if war comes." And war did come. Early in the spring, Fort Sumter was fired upon. This roused the North to the highest pitch of excitement. In April, President Lincoln called for volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The hour had come that Joshua Peniman and his sons had so long prayed might be spared them. On the morning of June 10th, Joe came and stood before him in the living room of the little soddy. Neither had slept. Joe's face was pale and his lips close set as he stood looking at his father. "I enlisted last night, Father," he spoke in a hoarse, shaken voice, and his lips moved stiffly as if he could with difficulty frame the words. Joshua Peniman started. He knew that it must come. Yet the dart passed no less cruelly through his heart because it had been anticipated. Already? He looked gray and worn. Lines that had not been there a few months before had written themselves in his forehead and creased his cheeks. As the lad looked at him his heart rose up and choked him. "Oh, Father," he cried, "I had to do it. It breaks my heart to go against your will, but I had no choice. I must go. Why, think what a skulker I would be if after all I have done and said I were to stay at home." "You were already under orders," Joshua Peniman said slowly. "You are a member of the Quaker Church. By your covenant with that body you have forsworn war. Your church and your God forbid you to fight. God himself has commanded that thou shalt not kill." "Oh, but Father, that means a different kind of killing. War is not murder." "War is always murder, the coldest, bloodiest, most terrible murder. Murder of the soul as well as the body." "Oh, no, Father, no, that isn't so," cried out the boy. "Think of the men who have engaged in war. Think of Washington. His soul was not killed by war. This is a thing that must be done. It is a duty. We must fight for the Union, liberty, freedom, for our own homes and firesides. This issue need not have been met by war. It would not have been if war-crazy hotheads had not forced it upon us. There is a better way for countries and nations to settle their difficulties than by war. Sometime men will come to realize its brutality, and nations will combine to adjust their controversies by reason, not might. I don't believe that such a time will ever come. But if it does, it is not here, now. This issue is upon us. What are we going to do? Sit passively and let the South secede and break up the Union? Why, even Jesus did not suffer evil passively. He drove the money changers from the temple, and he himself said, "Think not that I come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." But the sword that the Master speaks of in that passage of Scripture is not the literal sword, the sword used in war, but the sharp sword of conscience. Better that the Union be dissolved than that the hands of men should be stained with the blood of their brethren. "Oh, Father," cried Joe, "how can you say so? Do you care nothing for the preservation of your country?" Joshua Peniman flinched, and a hot flush passed over his face. "God knows that I love my country as well as any man," he answered sadly. "But dearly as I love my country, I love my God, my religion, and the commands that he has given me more." But remember what the Lord said to his disciples in the 22nd chapter of St. Luke. "But now he that hath a purse, let him take it, and likewise his scrip. And he that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." The time has come, Father, when it is our duty to go to war, when the man who tries to escape that duty is dishonoring his God as well as his country. The time has come when, as Jesus told his disciples, he that hath no sword should sell his very garment and buy one, and go forth to battle for the right. Joshua Peniman gazed into the face of his son with sorrowful eyes. "Thee knows thy Scripture, Joe," he said in an unsteady voice. "I have striven mightily for thee. I thought I had brought thee up in the faith of our fathers." Hot tears sprang into Joe's eyes. "You have! You have, Father! As God hears me, I would not take up arms against my fellow man for anything less sacred than the preservation of our nation. I have studied deeply into this question. I have searched the Scriptures, and I feel that it is my sacred duty to go. Remember what the Lord said to Ezekiel, 'Son of man, speak to the children of thy people, and say unto them, When I bring the sword upon a land, if the people of that land take a man of their coasts, and set him for their watchman. If when he seeth the sword come upon the land, he blow the trumpet and warn the people. Then whosoever heareth the trumpet and taketh not warning, if the sword come and take him away, his blood shall be upon his own head. He heard the sound of the trumpet and took not warning. His blood shall be upon him. But he that taketh warning shall deliver his soul. But if the watchman see the sword come, and blow not the trumpet, and the people not be warned, if the sword come and take any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity. But his blood shall I require at the watchman's hand." As the lad finished the long quotation from the book of Ezekiel, over which he had pored through many nights before, he fixed his gaze upon his father's face and said in a solemn voice, "We are the watchmen, Father. If we rise not now, if we do not blow the trumpet, then should our nation perish, should the youth of our land be cut down. The Lord, according to his word, will require their blood at the watchman's hand." Joshua Peniman gazed long and earnestly into his son's face, then laid his hand on his shoulder. "Thee has read thy scripture carefully, son. I must confess that I have never read it in that light before. Perhaps thee is right. God knows, I am sure that it would grieve thee to go against the teachings of thy father, thy church, and thy people. But I believe that thou art following what thou believest to be thy duty. It is breaking my heart, my son, but every man must settle an action of this kind for himself, according to his own conscience and his own God. If thou believest that the Lord sanctions thee, that it is thy duty to go, I will say no more. Go, and may God go with thee." The fire of youth and patriotism burned hotly in Joe's breast, but it was with a bowed head and wet eyes that he left his father's presence. All his life he had carried every pain, every grief and trouble to his mother, and he sought her now, kneeling beside her and burying his head in her lap. She, too, had passed a sleepless night. Many hours of it she had spent upon her knees, praying for strength and wisdom in the trial that was to come upon her. She showed the strain of anxiety and labor of the past 5 years, and the suffering of the present had left her wan and pale, with heavy shadows in her eyes. She clasped the boy to her and bowed her face upon his. "Oh, Mother," he cried, "you don't blame me, do you? You don't think that I am doing wrong? I'm not deserting God, Mother, or the Friends' religion, or you. I love the old faith. I believe in it. I'll live and die in it. But, oh, Mother, I have to go. No man who loves his country and is a man can hold back now." She held him close, tears streaming down her face. Presently he raised his head. "I'll have to go, dear. They are waiting for me. He hesitated, then said brokenly, "I enlisted last night." She gave a little gasping cry. "You have enlisted? Already? Oh, Joe, Joe!" "Lige enlisted too, Mother," he forced himself to tell her, "and Herbert, in the 1st Regiment of Nebraska Volunteers." "Lige? Lige, too?" Her cry stabbed him like a knife. "Yes, Mother, he asked me to tell you. You know how soft he is. He said he couldn't." "Lige? Lige, too?" she repeated in a stricken whisper. "Both my boys? My 2 eldest? My sons, my little boys? We came to this far country to save you this. We thought to keep you free from warfare and slaughter, and now it has come, even here. You, the descendants of old Quaker stock, you are going away to war?" He caught her in his arms and held her close, whispering to her, consoling her, explaining over and over again the convictions and principles that actuated himself and his brother in this, the most difficult and momentous decision of their lives. At length she was calmer, and withdrawing herself from his arms, said, "Send Lige to me." As he was leaving the room, she stopped him. "Joe, dear," she said, "thee must not feel hardly toward thy father. He is not a fanatic. His belief in the wickedness and futility of war is as deep and strong as his belief in God. He could not change it now, even for thee." When Joe left the room his heart felt ready to burst with pain. He knew that the call of his country was a sacred one. He felt in every fiber of his being that he was doing his plain duty as a man and an American. Yet the habit and training of years, the principles inculcated in him from babyhood, were not easily overcome. Even with a mind clear and positive upon his duty, doubts and fears and questionings rose to torture him. Blinded by the tears that would come in spite of all his efforts, he walked toward the river. So harassed and broken was he that he did not hear the murmur of voices in the little arbor they had built under the willow trees until he was very near it. Then he looked up suddenly and stood still. On the rough bench they had made on the river bank he saw Nina sitting, and Lige, with arms tightly clasped about her and his face close to hers, was gazing into her eyes. He could not hear the words that were spoken. His heart was beating too loud and fast, but he saw that her arms were about his neck, that her face was wet with tears, and that her eyes gazed into his with a look of love and sorrow. Up to this moment Joe had always thought of Nina as his sister. He knew that he had loved her devotedly from the first moment he had seen her. But it was only now, when the wild plunge of his heart, the wild fury in his breast, the hot, fierce current of blood that surged up to his brain brought the revelation to him that he knew that the love he felt for her was not that of a brother. For an instant a wild, mad rage against Lige filled him, made him want to strike him, to hurl him headlong from the arbor and down the bank of the river. Then the sense of fairness and justice that had always been a leading trait of his character asserted itself. Why, he asked himself, should Lige not love her as well as he? She was not their sister. He had the right. Handsome Lige. Merry, sparkling, generous Lige. No wonder she loved him. He stole away unobserved. Then, when he had reached the house, he called out loudly, "Lige! Oh, Lige! Mother wants you!" When he saw Lige coming he turned away. He hoped he was not selfish, but he could not speak to him then. He made no effort to see Nina alone, but bade her good-bye the next day with the same grave, sad, brotherly kiss that he gave to Mary and Sarah and Ruth. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28, In Field and Camp. When the first Nebraska volunteers embarked at Omaha under the command of Colonel John M. Thayer on July 21st, Joe and Elijah Peniman and Herbert James went with it. The troops were raw and undisciplined, the equipment poor, food scanty and hard to get. The Peniman boys, neither of whom had ever been away from home before, were desperately homesick, and seeing the sordidness of war, its meanness, its dirtiness, and its horror at close range, and losing some of their high vision in the daily muck and grind, came gradually almost to believe that their father was right, and that they had gone against his will, violated the faith of their childhood, and broken their mother's heart to follow a chimera that could only end in utter defeat. For weeks they got no nearer to war than a hot, dirty, disorderly, unsanitary camp where they were drilled from morning till night with aching shoulders and blistered feet, marched and countermarched under a broiling sun, eating hardtack and sow belly, and drinking water from foul ponds and muddy streams, and sleeping in fever-ridden swamps under rain that poured down upon them continually. For a long time Joe avoided his brother. The sight of Lige, so big and handsome in his uniform, with his bright brown eyes, his rich color, the dark curly hair that fell over his forehead under the visor of his soldier cap, roused in him a bitterness that he could not overcome. The knowledge that had come upon him so suddenly was a well-established fact in his mind now. He knew that he loved Nina, knew that he loved her with all the power and strength and passion of his young manhood, not as a brother loves a sister, but as a man loves the one woman in all the world for him. He could not banish her from his mind. In camp, in field, on march, standing guard in the rain at night, waiting for the signal to go into battle, her face was always before him. It angered him to see that Lige was not suffering as he suffered. He did not appear to be eating out his heart for her. He larked and sang with the other boys, for they were boys, mere boys, these defenders of the nation's integrity, and before many weeks had passed had become one of the most popular men in the regiment. Joe could not tell his trouble to Herbert, of whom he had grown very fond. That there had come an estrangement in his heart toward Lige, that brother who had always been almost like another self, was a thing of which he could not speak. But Lige did not seem to notice. So far as Joe could see, he treated him as he always had, with his jolly, careless affection. As soon as their drilling days were over and they were moved forward into action, he seemed to become possessed with the spirit of war. The excitement, the danger, the fighting, the constant sense of adventure appealed to his spirited, adventuresome nature, and he threw himself into action with an ardor that raised him from a private to a corporal in a short time. Whatever his thoughts, whatever his emotions, Joe could see that he found no time to put them on paper or to dwell much upon them in his own mind. Transportation was poor and the distance great, and they heard from home only at rare intervals. They had been gone 2 months when Joe received a small package one day, which, when he tore it open eagerly, he found to contain a daguerreotype of Nina. Poor as it was the early effort at photography, the face that smiled up at him from the shiny glass was so lovely that it caught his heart like a vice and left him gasping. She was 18 now, a woman, and in the proudly poised little head, the small oval face, the great violet eyes, and the shining nimbus of golden hair, there was that distinction that had always marked her as different from all others. He was curious to know if she had sent a picture to Lige, but could not bring himself to ask. The letter, which reached him at the same time, was like all her letters, clever, witty, affectionate, sisterly letters such as Ruth or Sarah might have written, and did write on occasion. The daguerreotype was in a little hinged case, which he carried in the pocket of his tunic over his heart for the remainder of the war. Throughout the years of '61 and '62, the cause of the Union suffered many disasters. The defeat and rout of the Battle of Bull Run had a most demoralizing effect on the Federal army. It demonstrated the fact that the soldiers needed more drilling and the army better organization before success on the field of battle was possible. General McClellan, in charge of the Grand Army of the Potomac, dallied and delayed while the South pushed on, winning victory after victory. In spite of the victories which the Northern arms had gained in the West, the winter was a gloomy one. But the campaign of 1863 brought new hope to the nation. The Battle of Shiloh was fought and won. Lee was beaten back at Antietam, and the news of the proclamation of emancipation went flashing over the world. At the beginning of 1863 the army in the West under General Rosecrans was near Chattanooga. Vicksburg and the whole Southwest was in danger, and the whole Union army was being pushed vigorously forward. The division of which Joe and Elijah Peniman and Herbert James were a part were rushed north to check Lee, who, after victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, was pushing north, even as far as southern Pennsylvania. The opposing forces met at Gettysburg, and the three boys were hurtled into one of the most stubborn and bloody battles of the war. The battalion with which they were connected had to cross a valley several hundred yards in width. On the left rose a hill which was being riddled with shot and shell. Joe, who was now a sergeant, was on the extreme left of the advance, his platoon being the supporting platoon of the left assault company. Along the steep slope of the hill facing them not 30 yards away was a cannon. They swung their guns around and opened a fusillade on the attackers. Joe, who was commanding the platoon, was ordered to advance with his men and cover the left flank. Suddenly, as they pushed forward, the valley became a shrieking bedlam. A company of Confederates on a hill far to the rear of the Union men sensed a new menace in the advance and opened up wildly against their position. The air was filled with howling bullets and shrieking shells. Some of the men dropped flat on their stomachs. Many of them were killed. It was a clear day. There had been mists in the valley in the morning which shrouded the hills, but as the sun rose they lifted so that the movements of the Union men were perfectly visible to the enemy along the ridges. They went stumbling upward through the leafy jungle, bullets whipping and snipping off the leaves and branches about them. Finally they debouched upon a path veering to the left in order to get behind the enemy. Joe's detachment made preparations to charge, but before they could move it seemed to them that all hell broke loose. Joe caught a glimpse of Lige, who was now a corporal, leading his men, his cap gone, his hair blown back from his forehead, his eyes filled with the lust of battle. The next moment he saw him fall. In that one second all the love that he had ever had for his brother came sweeping back in a great, overwhelming flood. He rushed toward him, but the demands upon him were too great, his responsibility too terrible for him to stop even for his brother. Officer after officer was falling around him. Colonel Baker went down with a shot through the lungs. Captain Young was shot in the stomach. Sergeant Elton had 3 bullets through his left arm. Private James, who fought beside him, had a wound in his shoulder. He caught a wild glimpse of him fighting with his left arm while a huge Confederate with clubbed musket rushed at him. Then Joe was swept on and saw him no more. They fought madly, blindly, desperately. At last but 7 of his platoon were left, yet he must cover his position. The little band drew grimly together, and the strain was so great, the excitement so terrible, that Joe had no time to feel even a thrill of surprise or joy when he found Lige fighting beside him. As in a dream he saw him crouch in the grass. Then he became aware that his rifle was cracking as regularly as the crack of a whip. For a brief instant he turned and looked down. Crouched low in the tall grass, with his rifle at his shoulder, Lige sighting as carefully as he was wont to do at home when he shot the heads off wild turkeys, he was potting the Confederates who manned the gun, dropping them one by one with the regularity and precision of clockwork. Suddenly an officer rose up near one of the guns, and with perhaps a dozen men behind him came charging down the hill. The young sergeant had no time to count his men, to see how many were left of that platoon that started out so gaily. Fixing his bayonet, he dashed at them. When the skirmish that ensued was over and he had time to look about him, he and Lige stood alone on the hill. The lieutenant with all his men lay scattered about them. It was not until the mad hell that raged about them was over and the battle won that the two boys realized that they had done anything out of the ordinary. Then they learned that they had cleaned out a position, routed the enemy, and left open the channel through which the Union troops rushed in and saved the day. It was a desperate battle, desperately fought and gallantly won. The Confederate army was defeated and beaten back, and Lee never tried the invasion of the Northern States again. That battle, bloody and terrific as it was really the turning point of the war. From that time the Confederate army began to languish. The end of slavery was at hand. Then came victories, victories and more victories for the North. Grant was made lieutenant general and entered upon his hammering campaign at Vicksburg. Sheridan was in the Shenandoah Valley. Sherman was marching through Georgia. His telegraph, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," gave a new courage to the whole country. Lincoln was reelected by a large majority. Through it all, Joe fought his battle with himself as silently and bravely as he fought the battle with his country's foes. When a moment of leisure came, and the two brothers could be together for a few uninterrupted moments, he sought Lige's society, talked with him of home and parents and brothers and sisters, spoke lovingly and tenderly of Nina, and gave him every opportunity and encouragement to tell his secret. But Lige did not speak. After many trials Joe, hurt to the quick, gave up the attempt and kept his own counsel. Sharper and fiercer grew the fighting. Lige was captured, made a brilliant and spectacular escape, was wounded once in the leg and twice in the shoulder, and came out a colonel, the most decorated man in the regiment. At last it was over. The long, bitter, bloody struggle was ended. The South, impoverished, exhausted, beaten, was obligated to surrender, and Lee handed his sword to Grant at Appomattox on a day which the United States will never forget. When the troops were mustered out, the Peniman boys, men now, with the strain and smirk of battle upon them, laid down their arms and returned to the homestead on the prairies, where anxious hearts, loving and weary hearts, were waiting to welcome them home. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Home Again. Those terrible 4 years of war had been an anxious, sorrowful time for the pioneers on the Nebraska prairies. Rumors reached even to the homestead of the unsanitary condition of the camps, of the thousands of deaths from fever, and the hearts of the parents were rent with anxiety for their two brave lads, lest even should they escape shot and shell they might fall a victim to disease. With the two older boys, upon whom he had depended so much, away at war, Joshua Peniman found the labor thrown upon him almost more than he could bear. Sam, who was now a fine, well-grown lad of 17, full of fun and energy, had done his best to take Joe's place. And Paul, whom the family had previously looked upon as one of the little ones, was now a big boy of 14, strong and agile, intelligent beyond his years, and able to do a large part of the work that Lige had always attended to. As the years of the struggle went on, Hannah Peniman's shining brown hair turned gray, and the deep blue eyes that gazed out over the lonely prairies came to have in them the look of those who wait and fear. Nina and Ruth clung together as if some deep, unspoken bond of sympathy lay between them, and day after day pored over the newspapers, read the few letters that came together, and lingered over them with clasped hands and tearful eyes. Mrs. Peniman noticed that many of these letters that Ruth watched and waited for so eagerly were addressed in a different hand from those of her brothers. Seeing that the postmark on them was the same as those on the letters from Lige and Joe, she asked who they were from. Ruth blushed deeply and said they were from Herbert. She was 17 now, dark and slender, graceful as a young fawn, with soft, tender brown eyes and a color like a prairie rose. Between her and Nina there seemed to be an affection that was deeper and closer than that of sisters. Nina had not seemed cheerful or well of late. The horrors of war seemed to weigh upon her with crushing sorrow. She grew thin and pale, read the news of every battle with feverish intensity, and often went away alone, wandering by herself for hours over the loneliness of the prairies. Mr. Peniman had long since set inquiries on foot both in New York and St. Louis in regard to the property the deeds to which had been found in the violated dispatch box, but as yet nothing had come of them, and the girl was as much in the dark as ever in regard to her past and future. Beatrice James came to the homestead often, and the three girls seemed to have much to talk about together, frequently banishing Sarah and Mary, whom they considered too young to share their confidences. "All they talk about is the soldiers, Mother," indignantly protested Sarah, who was now 13 and resented the indignity of being shut out. "And they cry and sniffle and get as sentimental as mush." Mrs. Peniman smiled. "Don't mind Sarah. They're at the sentimental age," she comforted. "You and Mary and I have more sense, haven't we?" Mary, who was now 10, glanced up from her task of dressing Spotty in a gingham apron. "They all want to be nurses," she commented scornfully. "Huh! I'd like to see Beatrice, or Nina either, put on a bandage. They'd faint away, both of them. Ruth is the only one who would make a good nurse. I guess," with a wise little nod of her curly head, "I guess they'd only want to take care of certain patients. Don't you think so, Mother?" Mrs. Peniman laughed, though a bit sadly, her heart quailing at the mention of wounds. "You're a wise little owl, Mary," she said, thinking to herself that Mary was probably right. There were periods of fearful anxiety, bitter disappointment, and deep depression as the first year of the war went by, and times when the issue looked doubtful and the hearts of loyal Unionists grew sick with fear. In the early spring of 1864 a terrible day dawned upon them. The Sioux, Cheyennes, and other hostile Indian tribes united to exterminate the white settlers, and a great Indian outbreak ensued, during which the entire frontier was paralyzed with terror. With the aid of Mr. James and Arthur, a stockade about 12 feet high was erected about the house and dugout, made from the young timbers along the creek, which were driven into the ground so close together that no living creature could pass through them. For days and many weary nights they feared to sleep, but with the whole James family as well as their own crowded into the house, watched and waited, fearing momentarily to hear the war whoops that would mean their destruction. Dozens of settlers in the western part of the territory were murdered, their homes laid waste, and their women carried away by the savages, and the settlers from the Blue Valley, the Platte Valley, and Salt Creek left their homes and fled to more protected counties. Many of their neighbors abandoned their newly located homesteads and fled for protection to the agencies or towns, but this Joshua Peniman refused to do. "We have worked too hard and sacrificed too much to get what we have here to abandon it," he said. "If thee and the little ones think best to go into town with the others, thee must do so, Hannah, but the boys and I, with Mr. James and Arthur, will stay here and protect our homes and property." "Then I will stay with thee, Joshua," answered his wife. "I have never yet deserted thee in danger or trouble, and I will not do so now. The stockade is high and strong and will act as some protection, and we will trust in the One who never forsakes us to keep us safe from harm." For many days they lived in terror, with weapons ready to give battle at a moment's notice from inside the stockade. The governor of the territory had called out troops, and the First Nebraska Volunteer Cavalry Company was assigned duty in that locality. The Indians were no match for the United States troops, and after burning, destroying, and massacring, the homes and families of many settlers were finally overcome, and sent flying across the border, while peace settled down over the distracted frontier. With April of the next spring came the glad news of Lee's surrender, and then the letters which told them that the boys were coming home. The boys were coming home! The lads whom they had prayed for, wept for, feared for, agonized over all these weary 4 years, were safe, well, coming home. The news ran like wildfire over the prairies. Every soddy, every dugout, every town and village and crossroads store was vibrant with it. In the Peniman household the joy was too great, too deep for words. It was decided that the whole family should go to Omaha to meet the returning soldiers. And on a glad morning, when all nature seemed to laugh with joy, when the very earth seemed to be rejoicing that the cruel war was over, they set out, Sam driving Kit and Billy, no longer young and skittish, but sobered by years and the exigencies of pioneer life on the plains. The former trading post had now developed into quite a city. Brick buildings were going up here and there, streets were laid out, and the squatties and shanties that had done service in the days of the trading station for Indians and trappers were giving place to good shops and stores. As the family passed through the little settlement on Salt Creek, at which Mr. Peniman and Sam had spent the night before the great blizzard, they were astonished to see its growth. It had developed from a straggling settlement into a town, was now called Lancaster, and not many years afterward was rechristened Lincoln and made the capital of the state. The troops were ferried across the Missouri, and as the Peniman family, with hundreds of others, stood watching the transports laden with the cheering, yelling, waving boys in blue, their emotions grew too strong to be controlled. The girls wept, the boys yelled, but Hannah Peniman could only gaze and gaze, her whole soul concentrated in her eyes. They saw them at last. Lige, mounted on the railing of the ferry boat, was waving his forage cap around his head, and shouting himself red in the face, and Joe stood beside him. He was very thin, very white, and had a great scar across his cheek. Leaning against the railing, his eyes were fixed intently on the shore. When the eyes of the long-parted ones met, there was a great shout, a tremulous, half-sobbing cheer, and discipline was utterly forgotten as mothers and sons, sisters and brothers, sweethearts and lovers rushed into each other's arms. Lige reached them first, in a rush that bore every one in the way before him, and caught his mother in his arms and held her to his breast. Joe was directly behind him and grasped his father's hand. There was no need for words between them now. Both knew that the war and its issues had answered all arguments, and as they held each other's hands, gazed into each other's eyes, both knew that the past was past and over, and that there existed no differences of opinion between them now. Lige rushed from one to another, kissing and hugging them all, laughing, sobbing, half beside himself with joy. But Joe was more quiet in his demonstrations. After he had held his mother in a long, close embrace, shaken hands with Sam and Paul, kissed and hugged little David, and kissed and embraced Sarah and Mary and Ruth, he turned to Nina and shook her hand. It was not until long afterward, when the first excitement was over, that he asked himself impatiently why he could not greet her as he had greeted his other sisters. Every one was too excited to notice her pallor, or to see that Ruth's great brown eyes were wide and terror-filled, and her face white and drawn. She waited her opportunity, then clasping Joe's arm, said tremulously, "Herbert! Joe, where is Herbert?" Joe started and looked down into her face. For the first time he realized that Ruth was no longer a little girl. For the first time he realized the thing that had been in Herbert's heart, that had drawn them so close together through the war. With a quick, indrawn breath he bent and clasped his arm about her. "Oh, Ruth," he said in a low voice. "Oh, little Ruth." Every vestige of color faded from her face. "Was he killed?" she whispered huskily. "We have not heard anything from him in so long." "No, no," he hastened to assure her. "He was not killed. He was captured at Gettysburg, but I heard that he had escaped. I haven't seen or heard from him since, but I think he's all right. He will probably turn up soon. Perhaps he may come home as a casual. He never got back to our regiment." The boys had been granted a furlough of a week, and the journey back over the prairies was a happy one. Everyone talking at once, so much to see, so much to hear, so much to tell, so glad and thankful to be together once more that words would not begin to express it. In the general hubbub of voices no one noticed that Nina was very silent, that the color had faded from her cheeks, and the light that had shone so transcendently in her eyes since the news of the homecoming of the boys had faded, leaving them dark and still. Joe, stealing a glance at her, thought that she had never been so beautiful, and when he turned to talk to her, her laugh was so gay, her chatter so light and merry that he thought he had fancied the shadow in her eyes. When they reached the homestead, Joe leaped down and patted Spotty, who came leaping and barking about the wagon, as if he too knew that the boys had come home and was wild with joy. Then he went to the team and put his arms about Kit's neck, laying his face against her smooth neck. Dear old Kit! Memories of all they had been through flooded over him and almost unmanned him. Both the returned soldiers were amazed and delighted to see the changes about the place. It was a wilderness no longer. Vines grew up over the little sod house, shading its windows and throwing their green tendrils and shining new leaves over the door. Trees had been planted about the place, walks made, and the fertile fields were already green with winter wheat. Romeo and Juliet had departed for that bourne from which no piggy returns, but were succeeded by a large and thriving progeny that were rapidly increasing in weight and value. Cherry was the mother of a fine 2-year-old calf, and Mother Feathertop and Dicky, the progenitors of the poultry yard, were no longer there to greet them, but had been succeeded by many fine broods of chickens, which had multiplied and accumulated wonderfully under Ruth's tender care. It was almost evening before the transports of rapture subsided and the boys went to their old place in the sod house to wash up and get ready for supper. When Joe entered he found Lige making a careful and fastidious toilet. "I suppose you are looking forward to a happy evening with Nina," he said, trying manfully to keep the pain that was wringing his heart from sounding in his voice. Lige was shining his shoes. He turned his head and looked up at his brother. "Nina?" he said interrogatively. Then going on with his shining with bent head, "Why, no, I thought I would go over to the Jameses. That is, if I won't be in the way. I thought I'd like to ask if they had heard anything about Herb." Joe stared at him. "Go over to the Jameses? Your first evening at home? Why, Lige!" Lige looked up with rather a red face. "Well, why not? We've been with the family all day, and I haven't seen Beatrice and——" "But Nina, what will she think? How will she feel?" "Nina? What the deuce——" Lige suddenly suspended operations on his boots and straightened up, holding the brush extended and staring at his brother. "Good Lord!" he ejaculated suddenly. For a moment he continued to stare, then dropped the shoe brush and caught Joe's arm. "What do you mean? You don't mean—you don't think that Nina—that there is anything between us, do you?" he demanded. Joe turned white to the lips. "Why, I—" he managed to stammer. "Great Jehoshaphat!" ejaculated Lige. "That's what's been eating you. I couldn't understand it. I thought it was Beatrice." "Beatrice? What the dickens do I care about Beatrice?" panted Joe. "I thought you loved Nina and that she loved you. I saw you kiss her." "Well, Lord A'mighty, why shouldn't I kiss her? She's my sister, isn't she? I kiss Ruth and Mary and Sara. Why shouldn't I kiss her?" Joe's heart was pounding so he could hardly speak. "Yes, but that's different. She isn't our sister, you know. I saw you together the night before we went away, and her arms were around your neck, and she was talking about you every minute of the time, you big booby, begging me to take care of you and bring you home safe and all that. Oh, gosh, this does beat all. Why, here was me trying to do the noble brother act and forget all about little Beatrice because I thought you cared for her, while all the time you were hating me like old Harry because you thought I'd cut you out with Princess. Why, Lord love you, boy, what's the matter with you? Are you as blind as a bat? Can't you see how she feels toward you? Why, there never was anyone else in the whole world for Nina but just you. Ever since that first day when she refused to ride anywhere else in the wagons but beside you." Joe's face was as white as chalk, his eyes fastened on his brother's face, and his breath coming quick and short. "Is it true, Lige?" he asked after a little interval in a strained whisper. "True? Well, you are a duffer if you haven't seen it yourself. Didn't you see her face when you gave her that cold little handshake today? She could hardly keep from crying all the way home. I thought you didn't care about her at all. I thought all the time you cared for Beatrice." "Beatrice? As if I could ever think of Beatrice when Nina was around. Do you really think she cares, Lige? That she doesn't care for me just as a brother?" "Go along and ask her, you old gooseling," cried Lige, busily adjusting a new tie. "As for me, I'm going over to the Jameses so fast you can't see me for the dust. I've been afraid to even write to little Bee for fear I'd be making trouble for you. But now that I know what a goose you are—" He clapped on his soldier cap and shot through the door, leaving Joe standing motionless beside the window, with wildly beating heart. Twilight was coming before he found courage to wander down to the river. He found Nina sitting in the little arbor alone. She had been with Ruth for the past hour, trying to comfort her, and her eyes were red and her heart cold as she sat gazing down at the water. Joe came so quietly that she did not hear him. For a long moment he stood gazing at her, his very heart in his eyes. She was more beautiful than ever, startlingly, exquisitely lovely as she sat with bent head, the sunlight flickering through the golden waves of her hair, the pure oval of her cheek and chin, a little sharpened in the years he had been away. He entered the arbor noiselessly and sat down by her side. "Joe!" she cried, and started violently. Very tenderly he took the little hand that lay trembling in her lap. "Nina," he said, bending his head close to hers, "are you really glad I have come home?" "Glad?" The tears she had been trying to conceal rushed into her eyes. "Glad, Joe? There are no words that can tell how glad. Oh, we have all missed you so. Sometimes I have thought that Mother would die of grief and longing. And Father, oh, Joe, his patience, his gentleness, his suffering, his noble and generous admission of his mistake. But you, Nina, you—" She lowered her lashes and gently drew her hand away. "I, Joe? Why, of course I am glad. Why shouldn't I be glad? Both my dear brothers back from the war. But I am not your brother, Princess. I don't want to be your brother." Then suddenly the denial that he had so long set on his heart burst its bonds and cried to her, "Oh, Nina, Nina, dearest, sweetest, loveliest girl in all the world, I don't want you for my sister. I love you. I love you. I want you for my love, my sweetheart. Something nearer, dearer, sweeter than a sister. I want you for my wife." From Nina's parted lips came a little smothered cry, and she covered her face with her hands. Joe drew them down gently. "I have always loved you, Princess. Ever since the day that I first saw you out there on the desolate prairies, lying on the graves of your father and mother, I have always loved you." Nina looked up at him, tears flooding the purple splendor of her eyes. "Oh, Joe, Joe, why didn't you tell me so before?" she cried. "You went away to the war, and I might never have known. I thought you cared for me only as a sister, and I have suffered. My God, how I have suffered, thinking that you did not care for me while I—" He caught her in his arms and pressed her to his heart. "While you— Say it, darling, say it. My heart has been breaking for those words. I thought I should never hear them from your lips. I thought you loved Lige. I could not speak because I thought he loved you and you cared for him. The night before we went away I saw you in his arms, and I thought— She drew herself from his clasp and gazed into his eyes. "You thought I cared for Lige?" "Yes, dearest, yes. I truly, truly did." "And you went away without a word? You gave up your own chance of happiness because you thought you were adding to mine? And his? But what about me, Joe? I almost broke my heart trying to make myself love you like a sister. Oh, Joe, Joe, how like you! And you never suspected about Beatrice. Oh, Joe, you dear, darling old simpleton, how could you think such a thing? Didn't you know that there never was, never could be, any one else in all the world but you?" Darkness had quite come when they went back to the house together. As they entered the kitchen hand in hand, Hannah Peniman looked up, and a little cry escaped her lips. Nina ran to her and hid her head on her breast. Joe took her hand and slipped his arm about her. "I've been such a fool, Mother," he said tenderly, "but I've come out of it better than I deserved. I thought that Lige cared for Nina, and I was going to just step aside and never let any one know how I felt. But I find I was mistaken, and that Princess cares for me. Are you glad, Mother? Tell us that you are glad that she is really and truly going to be your daughter." "She could never be more truly my daughter than she is now," said Mrs. Peniman, kissing the white brow that nestled against her shoulder. "But I am glad that she and you have found each other, for true love is the greatest thing in the world." It was long after midnight when Lige came home, bursting into the room where Joe lay in the darkness, with a tumult in his heart too great for sleep. Lige rushed up to the bed and grasped his hand. "Congratulate me, old boy!" he cried. "By golly, I'm the happiest chap in all Christendom to-night. She loves me, Joe. She really loves me. I can hardly believe it even yet. And she's loved me all the time I've been away. I'm so happy. "I bet you're not any happier than I am," cried Joe, returning the grip of his hand. "You are? Bully! Then you and Nina have fixed it up all right? Good! I'm mighty glad. Lord, Joe, I wish I'd suspected it sooner. It would have saved us both a lot of heartaches. But no matter. They're all over now, and perhaps we fought all the better for feeling that we hadn't so much to live for at home." And while the boys lay in their old bed exchanging confidences and talking in whispers of the happiness that was to be theirs, and Nina, glowing with a happiness she had thought to never know, kept watch and ward through the silent night, little Ruth lay on the other side of the curtain and wept for the boy who did not come home. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Ruth Receives a Surprise. With the return of the young men of the West from the war, the settlement and development of the new country made rapid strides. The free homestead law, which had been signed by President Lincoln, took effect in 1863 and provided that any man or woman 21 years old or the head of a family could have 160 acres of land by living on it for 5 years and paying about $18 in fees. Joe and Lige, who were now of age, immediately filed claims on the tracts of land that their father had staked out for them near his own 8 years before, and proceeded joyfully to build upon them the houses necessary to hold the claims, which each fondly hoped would shelter a bride before another year had rolled away. Ruth was not yet old enough to file a claim, but Nina, who had passed her 21st birthday, filed a claim on a beautiful tract of land next to Joe's, near the river. Sam, who was only 20, had already taken out a timber claim and was planting trees upon it in his spare time, and both he and Paul had pieces of land located upon which they meant to preempt as soon as they were old enough. In spite of the thankfulness she felt for the return of her brothers, Ruth could not be happy. She tried to enter into all the joy of the household, but the sight of Joe and Nina walking hand in hand in the moonlight, of Lige and Beatrice scampering across the prairies on their ponies, caused an ache in her heart that kept her sleepless many nights and wet her pillow with tears. She had kept her secret while Herbert was away, feeling that they were both too young to become formally engaged. But she knew that she loved him as she could never love any other man, and that if he never returned there would be a grave in her heart for all eternity. Joe and Lige did their utmost to comfort her, but felt as the days crept by that there was little chance of Herbert's return. Joe's ambition to become a lawyer had never faltered, and as soon as he had received his discharge from the army he immediately set to work to prepare himself for his examination for admission to the bar. He studied hard, and the reading that he had done during the long days while he plowed in the fields now stood him in good stead. A month after his return he went to Nebraska City and took his examination, which he passed with high honors and was admitted to practice law in the state. He left the building with his certificate in his pocket and pride and exultation in his heart. He was a lawyer. The ambition of his boyhood was fulfilled. It now remained with him to make the rest of his dreams come true. As he walked along jubilantly he saw a group of men coming toward him wearing the familiar blue uniform. He had returned to citizen's clothes, but the sight of the old uniform still thrilled him, and with the feeling of comradeship that it always inspired in him he stopped and waited for them to come up. They walked very slowly, and as they came nearer he saw that they supported between them one of their comrades, who tottered like an old man. "That fellow ought to be in an ambulance instead of on foot," he thought, and walked toward the group. As he reached them the man who was being supported raised his head. Herbert! My God, Herbert!" he cried, and clutched the yellow, skeleton-like hands. The gaunt figure raised a haggard, ashen face, with hollow eyes and unshaven cheeks. "Joe!" he whispered in a weak voice. "Thank God!" Joe had his arm about him by this time, supporting him. Casting a swift glance up and down the street, he saw a man coming toward them in a wagon. "Here!" he shouted. "Take this soldier to a hotel, won't you? He's sick, wounded. He is not able to walk." The war was too fresh in the minds of the people for any one to hesitate. Willing hands lifted the emaciated frame of the young soldier into the wagon. Joe sprang in beside him, and a few moments later Herbert James was in a hot bath, laid in a clean bed, with a doctor and nurse beside him. When he could speak he told Joe that he had been captured and held in a Southern prison, where the conditions were so terrible that it was a miracle a single man came out of it alive. He had just been exchanged, he said, and he and the companions whom Joe had seen with him were on their way home when Joe met him. Joe saw that there was something on his mind of which he hesitated to speak, and after a little time he asked for Ruth, so bashfully and with an expression of such wistfulness in his hollow eyes that Joe's heart rejoiced. He told him that Ruth was well, but very unhappy at his failure to return, at which a faint color stained the boy's thin cheeks, and he turned his face to the wall and lay silent for many moments. When he had fallen asleep, Joe asked the doctor how soon he could be taken home, and was told that the sooner he reached home the better. "All he needs now is food and rest and care," he continued, "and it will take a lot of that, and considerable time before he is much better." When the young soldier awakened, it was to find a new suit of citizen's clothes laid out upon a chair, his filthy, tattered old uniform destroyed, and a barber waiting to shave him. When he had eaten, was bathed and shaved and dressed he looked better. "Now we're going home, old chap," Joe told him, whereat the poor broken youth began to cry. Joe now had a side-bar buggy to which he drove Kit, and with Herbert beside him, made as comfortable as possible with rugs and pillows, they started for the Blue. When they came in sight of the homestead, Herbert gave a glad cry. "I never thought to see it again," he cried. Joe lifted him out of the buggy and supported him into the house. Fortunately, Ruth had gone for a walk with Nina. Mrs. Peniman received him almost as joyfully as if he had been one of her own sons. He seemed too exhausted to go farther, and a message was sent to his parents by David, who almost caused the death of Mrs. James by bursting into the house and yelling at the top of his voice that Herbert had come home. The James family arrived at the homestead a few minutes later, and Mrs. Peniman went out and closed the door, leaving the young soldier to meet and greet his mother. Half an hour later Ruth and Nina came home. It was evident that Ruth had been crying, and they walked slowly, with Nina's arm clasped about her waist. Mrs. Peniman sent the children away and stood in the door awaiting them. As they came up to her she put her arms about Ruth and drew her to her side. "Ruth," she said gently, "I have news for thee. A message has come." Ruth started forward, the color ebbing out of her face. "From Herbert?" she whispered. "Yes, there is a message from Herbert." "Is thee strong enough to bear a shock?" "A shock? Then he is dead?" "No, no, I did not mean that. But we have news. Someone has come." "Someone has come? Herbert?" And without waiting for the preparation that her mother had intended, she rushed into the house. For an instant she stood inside the door with white face and distended eyes. Then, hearing the low murmur of voices, she dashed aside the curtains and saw Herbert lying on the bed. The two young people uttered a simultaneous cry and a moment later were locked in each other's arms. It was not for many minutes that Ruth could look at him, that she saw the wreck that war had made of the handsome boy she had loved. But when she did see, it made no difference in her love. With the wealth of mother love that had always overflowed her gentle heart, she soothed and comforted him, told him that he would soon be well, and promised that she would nurse him back to life and health. The next day she went quietly to her father and told him that she wanted him to marry them. "It will take months to nurse him back to himself, Father," she told him, "and I am the one who can do it best. I can give him better care as his wife than I could as his sweetheart, and I want to marry him right now." The family protested, but Ruth was never known to abandon an idea once she had set her mind upon it, and after some argument on the subject, her family at last gave in. "She might as well be nursing Herbert as a chicken with a broken wing or a dog with a sore foot," smiled her father, "for you know Ruthie will always be taking care of something. We all know and like Herbert, and have no objection to her marrying him sometime, and I know no reason why, if they both desire it, Ruth should not be given the privilege of nursing her husband back to health." Mrs. Peniman finally agreed to this, and that evening as the sunset glow shone into the little soddy, Herbert was propped up in his bed, and Ruth, in a simple little white dress, with the flush and glow of radiant happiness upon her face, stood with her hand in his while her father spoke the solemn words that made them man and wife. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of A Prairie-Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine MAULE. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Joe Hears a Strange Story. Civilization was now moving westward with rapid strides. The part of the territory in which the Peniman family had cast their lot had been organized into a county, and a thriving little town had sprung up about 5 miles from their homestead, which had been made the county seat. It was here that Joe decided to open his law office and begin the serious business of his life. Sam and Paul were now old enough to take his place at home, and he saw no reason why he should not begin his life work, continuing to live at home, and doing what work he could mornings and evenings. He had managed to save up a little money, and with it he rented a small one-story frame building containing 2 rooms, and after building his bookshelves with his own hands, he disposed upon them his precious library, bought a table and 2 chairs, and hung out his shingle, "Joseph Peniman, Attorney at Law." One of his first cases was that of an Indian brought to him by Pashepaho, for whom he obtained justice against a white man for fraud. This case received wide notice in the territory, and before long the young attorney had a large Indian clientele, whom he served with fairness and honesty, demanding for the red man the same justice that the law provided for white settlers. By this time Joshua Peniman was considered one of the leading men of the county, and the family were all well and favorably known. Joe's anti-slavery speeches had made him many friends, and it was not long after his admission to the bar before he had a good practice. In the fall of '65 the first election was held, and he was nominated for floating delegate to the legislature. He had been too busy since his return from war to go to Omaha to call on his friend Judge North, but shortly after his nomination, while he was sitting in his office one day busily preparing a brief, the door opened and Judge North walked in. Joe sprang up to meet him joyously. "I heard that you had returned safely," said the judge, warmly shaking his hand, "and I've been expecting that you would drop in to see me. But as you didn't, and as I had business here in the county, I thought I'd come to see you." Joe expressed his pleasure in seeing him. "Thought you were coming up to study law in my office," smiled the judge, casting a glance about the modestly furnished little office. Joe colored, then smiled. "I took my examination a few weeks ago," he answered, "and as I got my certificate and felt that I couldn't lose time, I thought I'd better not study any longer but begin work on my own hook." "You're right, my boy." And as he spoke the same strange, elusive resemblance that always tormented him when in the Judge's presence again flashed through Joe's mind. They talked for a long time, Joe telling of the war and his experiences, Judge North informing him of many things that had taken place during his absence and were soon to take place in the state. As the sun declined Joe looked at his watch. "Come home to dinner with me, Judge, and meet my family," he said. "I have often talked to Father and Mother about you, and I would like you to meet them. It's only a short ride, and I have my buggy here." The Judge, who had contemplated spending the night at the little crossroads hotel, gladly accepted the invitation. It was twilight as they drove across the prairies and approached the little soddy. The warm, rosy afterglow was lingering in the sky, and silhouetted against it a figure moved toward them across the prairie, a light, graceful figure, the afterglow touching its crown of golden hair into gleaming splendor. As they drew nearer Judge North fastened his eyes upon the girl who was coming to meet them, with a strange, intent expression. When she raised her hand and waved to them, he turned to Joe swiftly. "Who is that girl?" he asked. "It is my a foster sister," Joe answered, his face flushing a little. "I asked," explained Judge North, "because as she came toward us in this light she bore such a remarkable resemblance to someone I loved very dearly." The girl had drawn nearer now, and seeing that there was a stranger in the buggy was about to turn back when Judge North leaned forward and stared at her, then leaped out and ran to her. "Marian!" he cried. "Marian!" The girl stopped, then turned to him inquiringly. The lawyer was breathing quickly and his face was pale, his eyes intent as he leaned forward staring at her. "My God!" he breathed. "Her face, her voice, her hair! It must be! I can't be dreaming! Marian! Marian!" Nina came toward him. For some reason she too appeared greatly moved. "My name is not Marian," she said. "My name is Nina, but Marian was my mother's name." "Your mother's name? Then you are her daughter. You must be the child of Marian North." "No, of Marian Carroll." "Marian Carroll! Oh, thank God at last, at last!" He sprang forward and clasped Nina's hand. "Your mother was Marian Carroll, Marian North, my sister, my precious little sister, who was lost and whom I have been searching for all these years. Where is she? Where is she? You are her living image. I thought when I first saw you that it was she. I had forgotten the lapse of years. I should have known you were her daughter anywhere." Nina had turned white, and Joe, who had thrown the lines to Paul, now came up to them. "Come into the house," he said quickly, slipping his arm about her. "This is very strange. There must be much to tell and much to hear. Come, Nina. You are shaking so you can hardly stand." He led the way swiftly to the house. Inside the door Mr. and Mrs. Peniman were waiting to receive them. After a hasty introduction Joe explained to them what had just taken place. "I know now," he cried. "I have always seen a resemblance in Judge North to someone I had seen. Now I know that it was to Nina, to Mrs. Carroll, whom I have never forgotten. Don't you see it, Father? Isn't it so?" Joshua Peniman had been gazing at the stranger with keen scrutiny. "Yes," he said, "I see the resemblance to the unfortunate young mother very plainly. I also see a certain look that is like Nina, which is only natural, as Nina is the image of her mother." Then turning to the stranger, I was with Mr. and Mrs. Carroll in the last hour of their lives. I buried them on the prairies and took their child with us in our wagons. Sit down, friend. This is a strange dispensation of Providence. Tell us what you know of this strange tale." Judge North seemed unwilling to let go of Nina's hand. Drawing her close to his side, he sat down at the table. Joshua Peniman, in his clear, calm fashion, told the story of the arrival of the Carrolls in their wagon at their camp on the prairies, of Lee Carroll's tragic death, of the subsequent death of Mrs. Carroll, and their taking charge of the child, of the raid upon the wagons by the Indians, the taking of the dispatch box, and the kidnapping of Nina by Red Snake. The lawyer listened with intense interest. "And this white man, this Red Snake, what of him? Did you ever see him?" he asked eagerly. "I saw him several times," said Joe. "What was he like?" "He was tall, powerful, but slenderly built, with red hair, a long, red, dissipated face, and a short, sandy mustache." Judge North brought his hand down upon his knee with a sounding blow. "A Red Carroll!" he ejaculated. Then turning to Nina, who stood with blanched face and parted lips beside him, he led her with gentle, old-fashioned courtesy to a chair. "Sit down, child," he said. "I have a strange story to tell that touches you nearly." The family had all gathered about him now, anxious to hear the solution of the mystery that had baffled them so long. "I know who Red Snake was," he began. "His name was Bernard Carroll. He was a brother of the Lee Carroll whom you buried on the prairies." "A brother?" cried out Joe. "Why, it was he that killed him." "I don't doubt it at all. He was a bad man, a degenerate, a scoundrel, from his very boyhood. The two brothers were descendants of a splendid old family, the Carrolls, of Virginia. But every few generations there appears in that family a Red Carroll. The family are all of dark complexion, and whenever a red-haired Carroll appears among them, there is sure to follow trouble and disaster. Before he was 20 years old, Bernard Carroll had broken his mother's heart and caused her death. When he was 23 he fell wildly, madly, passionately in love with my sister Marion." "Marion? My mother? That was why he stared at me so. That was why he called me Marion," panted Nina. The judge turned his eyes upon her. "Yes, no doubt it was. You are marvelously like her, startlingly like what she was at your age. He wooed her with the same fiery zeal, with the same ardor and passion that he carried into every act of his life. For a time his good looks, his native charm, his passionate wooing attracted her. Then, as she came to know him better, she turned from him with loathing. It was just at this time that Lee came home from college. He too fell in love with Marion, and she returned his love. In a short time they became engaged." He paused, as a short, broken sob escaped from Nina's lips. He laid his hand over hers affectionately, then resumed. "Bernard never forgave either of them. For Lee he developed a hatred that was shown in every act of his life. He was drinking heavily at the time, and as his extravagance threatened to ruin the family, his father put him on an allowance, which no amount of whining or bullying would induce him to increase. He laid all his father's sternness at Lee's door, and set deliberately to work to ruin him in his father's affections. With the cunning of the snake, for which he was so well named, he crawled and wormed himself into his father's confidence, and then with devilish malice began to poison his mind against his younger son. Lee and Marion had married by this time and were starting out in life together. Bernard forged his brother's name to a check and made his father believe him a criminal. The father denounced him and turned him out of the house. Lee, indignant, hurt, grieved to the heart that his father should doubt him, high-spirited and stubborn, as all of the Carrolls are, left home with his young wife and went to New York to earn his living. A short time afterward a child was born to them, and they went abroad. It was while Lee was abroad, and all communication between himself and his family had been cut off, that Bernard again began to go the pace. He forged another check, which was traced to him. He was arrested and fled the country. His father was relentless. Bernard had prejudiced him against and separated him from his younger and dearer son, had caused the death of his mother, and the old man was determined to punish him to the fullest extent of the law. But Bernard was never found. Once he was heard from in Iowa. Someone who knew him saw him on a wagon train headed for the gold fields of California. Then all trace of him was lost. I presume that growing more and more degenerate, he took to using drugs as well as liquor, became a squaw man, and settled among the Indians. When his voice ceased, there was a deep silence in the room. Nina, with her violet eyes fixed intently on the face of her uncle, had scarcely stirred during the narrative. The keen mind of Joshua Peniman was busy putting two and two together. Suddenly he rose from his chair, and going to a chest in a corner of the soddy brought out the two deeds that had been found in the dispatch box. This would indicate that the father forgave Lee and deeded this property to him, he said, handing the deeds to Judge North. The lawyer examined them critically. Then he looked up with an eager light in his eyes. "Have you ever done anything about these?" he asked. "Yes," answered Mr. Peniman. "I have done all that I could with the limited knowledge and means I possessed. I have tried to set inquiries on foot regarding them, but as yet have had no results." Judge North put the deeds in his pocket. "I will take this matter up at once," he said. "This should be valuable property. Bernard would never have allowed it to fall into the hands of Lee's child if he could have used it himself. But he knew that he dared not claim it." Turning to Nina, he laid his hand on her head. "And so, after all the search of years, I have found my niece at last. I had almost believed I never should do so. And then," breaking into a genial smile, "I accept an invitation to dinner with my young friend here, and find my beautiful young niece, the very image of the little sister I lost, and for whom I had so grieved, awaiting me." He put out his arms, and Nina, with a glad little cry, ran into them. "Of course you must come and live with me now," he began, but got no farther, for from the whole Peniman family there rose a cry of simultaneous protest. Nina, blushing rosy red, turned a shy glance on Joe. He at once came to the rescue. Crossing the room, he laid his hand upon the Judge's shoulder. I hope you won't mind, Judge," he said awkwardly, "but the truth is that Nina has promised to live the rest of her life with me." The Judge turned and looked at him, then burst into a roar of laughter. "Well, well, well!" he cried. "To think that the young man I have liked so much would steal such a march as that on me. So you have promised to live the rest of your life with this young chap, have you, niece? And I suppose you'd much rather do that than come live with a lonely old man like me." Nina could not truthfully deny the statement, but softened the blow by putting her arms about his neck and kissing him softly on the forehead. It was Judge North's wish to give the young couple a fine wedding in Omaha, but this they firmly declined. Lige and Beatrice had decided to be married soon, and the two young couples had planned a double wedding, at which the gentle Quaker father, minister, justice, should officiate. It was while the preparations for the double wedding were going briskly forward that Joe received a letter from Judge North one day, asking him to come to Omaha at once and bring Nina with him. When they arrived, the judge met them at the door and led them into his private office. They saw that he looked very grave, and they were no sooner seated than he turned to Nina and took her hand. "My child," he said, in a tone that sent premonitory chills of trouble into the hearts of the two young people, "you must prepare yourself for a great blow." "A blow?" Nina turned pale. "What kind of a blow?" Joe, too, also whitened. "What is it, Judge?" he asked, wondering if some insurmountable barrier to his marriage with Nina had been discovered. "I have been very busy tracing back these deeds and looking up the estate that I hoped your grandfather Carroll had left his son," the Judge went on, "and which you, as his only heir, should inherit. But to my deep regret and sorrow I found that the property, the deeds of which were found in the dispatch box, had long ago passed into the hands of some distant cousins, and that the fortune which we supposed Colonel Carroll to possess was so wasted by his spendthrift son, and so dissipated by his long search for Lee and his own long illness, that there was nothing of it left when the will was probated." "Is that all?" Nina drew a deep breath and loosened the grip of her hands in her lap. "Great heavens, Uncle, you nearly frightened me out of my wits. I thought something terrible had happened." "But it is terrible, my dear," said her puzzled uncle. "You don't seem to understand. There is no money for you to inherit. I thought you would be a great heiress. I hoped you would get a large sum of money from that property." Nina burst into a ringing laugh. "Nonsense, Uncle! Who cares? What would I want with a great deal of money? I don't care a button about the fortune. I've found you, and know all about my dear father and mother now, and I've got Joe, so what more could I ask?" "But, my dear," cried her distressed uncle, gazing at the shining eyes and smiling face with amazement. Nina sprang across the room and threw her arms around his neck with another burst of laughter. "Don't bother any more about it, dear," she cried. "Just let's forget all about the money part of it and be happy. I'm sure it will never give me another thought, if Joe doesn't mind taking a penniless bride." Joe's expression as he gazed at her would indicate that he did not mind in the least. "As a matter of fact," he admitted, "I feel rather relieved. I don't know whether I should feel equal to living up to a rich wife or not." Then more seriously, "No, Judge, don't let's lose any sleep about that. Nina and I have grown up poor, and I guess we shall never be any happier than we were in the little soddy back home. I have my profession, the state is growing, new business is coming in, I have my homestead, and the little house on it where we can begin, and I guess we'll manage to get along and be pretty happy with that." Judge North, who had been exceedingly worried and unhappy since he had received the news in regard to the property, looked at the young couple with surprise, and his face cleared. "Well," he ejaculated, "I think you're a great pair of young simpletons, but I'm glad you take it that way. I don't think, however, that you need feel much uneasiness about your future. The new West is opening up. There are going to be great adventures and opportunities for young men, and Joe has a good start and the prospect of a brilliant future." "Of course he has," cried Nina. "Why should we worry about a little old money? Joe is going to be one of the biggest men in the new state." The Judge patted her head and sighed while he smiled. "He ought to be, with a love and belief like that behind him," he said, a little wistfully. It was now fall, and Herbert was once more almost himself again, thanks to Ruth's good nursing. She entered into the preparations for the double wedding with all the interest and enthusiasm she had had no opportunity to expend on her own wedding. It was a glorious autumn morning when the little party left the sod house and walked quietly across the fields that were just beginning to put on their robes of brown and russet and gold, splashed here and there with brilliant dashes of color made by goldenrod and sumac, and starred with St. Michaelmas daisies, while the great yellow sunflowers lifted their proud heads to the kiss of the morning, and the meadowlarks poured forth their thrilling melody through the golden sunlit air. Joe walked with his mother, his arm about her waist, his tall form bent to hers, as he talked in low and tender tones of all that he meant to do for her and his father and the children in the days that were to come. Nina, radiant and lovely as the morning, dressed in the white, creamy white she loved, was with her uncle, leaning lightly on his arm, while she chattered with Ruth and Herbert, who walked beside them, and Sarah and Mary, who as bridesmaids to the party were charming in their garlands of wild flowers and their simple little dresses of virgin white. Lige walked with Mrs. James, his handsome head thrown back, his face shining with happiness, and his eyes turned continually upon Beatrice, who skipped gaily along by the side of her father, lovely as a picture in her bridal white. Sam and Paul, who were to act as best men to the wedding party, felt just a bit out of it as they trudged along behind, and David, now a sturdy little chap of 10 years, skipped in and out, now with one group, now with another, the pet of the family, welcomed and admired by all. At the door of the little church on the prairie, Joshua Peniman awaited them. His hair was gray, his face lined and pale, and in his eyes was the expression of one who had been communing with another world. As the friends and relatives crowded into the pews and the two young couples approached the altar, there was a little bustle and stir at the back of the church, and Joe looked back to see a sight that touched him deeply. About the door was crowded a large party of Indians, the friends whom he and Nina had made in their captivity among them, and those he had made in later days. They were all there, squaws, bucks, papooses, grinning at him from the door, and among them was the tall form of Pashepaho and the stately Neowage, who had come many, many miles to witness the wedding of their friend. Joe rushed to the back of the church to meet them, insisted they must all come inside, and ushered them down the aisle to the front pews, as proudly as if they had been the mayor of the city and governor of the state and their staffs. They wore no hats, their hair was braided with beads and feathers in honor of the occasion, and Pashepaho bore on his arm a magnificent otter skin as a wedding gift, while Neowage carried a wonderful pair of elk horns that adorned Joe's home for many years. Slowly the gentle patriarch mounted the pulpit. Quietly the two young couples took their places before him, and with solemn voice he read the ceremony that united their lives. When the wedding was over they all returned to the homestead, where a wedding feast had been prepared, and the Indians were among the most honored guests. They refused to sit on chairs, never having become accustomed to that luxury, but squatted on the grass. They enjoyed the feast as well as any of the guests. When it was over Joe and Nina left for Omaha, where his legislative duties were soon to begin. Lige and Beatrice drove over to the county seat, where Lige, now a cashier in the bank, had built a modest home for his gay little singing bird. Ruth and Herbert left for the home that they had built on their homestead, and as the shadows of night came down, Joshua and Hannah Peniman, with their shrunken household, were left alone. "We have given much to the new West, Joshua," she said, gazing with moist eyes about the little soddy that looked so lonely and empty in the waning light. "It was that for which we became pioneers," answered Joshua Peniman, laying his hand over hers. End of Chapter 31. Recording by Sharon Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of A Prairie Schooner Princess by Mary Katherine Maule.